Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a crisp spring morning in March 2025, the city of Seattle, Washington, woke to headlines that would soon dominate national news. A seemingly ordinary neighborhood in the Ballard district, known for its tree-lined streets, small cafes, and young families, had become the center of one of the most chilling criminal cases of the decade. What began as a series of quiet observations by neighbors escalated into a terrifying ordeal that would claim multiple lives and shock the community. This is the story of the Sullivan family, a story of love, ambition, and tragedy, but also of mistakes, overlooked warning signs, and a criminal mind operating in plain sight. The Sullivan family had long been admired in their community. Michael Sullivan, 42, was a software engineer for a prominent tech company in Seattle. He was recognized not only for his work in cybersecurity, but also for mentoring young developers and volunteering at local STEM workshops. Michael's meticulous nature extended to his family life. Married to Sarah Sullivan, 39, since 2005, he maintained a household built on care, structure, and encouragement. Sarah Sullivan, born in Tacoma, Washington, had always been the heart of the family. A former pediatric nurse, she had devoted her career to children's health and now worked part-time at a local clinic while managing the household. Her warm presence was felt by everyone who came into contact with her. She had a unique ability to make patients, neighbors, and friends feel truly seen and supported. Despite the pressures of her job and raising 3 children, she maintained a calm and nurturing home, the kind that became a safe harbor in a world that often felt chaotic. The Sullivans had 3 children. Olivia, 17, was the eldest. Bright, ambitious, and compassionate, she had been accepted into several prestigious universities and had a passion for social justice causes. Her younger brother, 14-year-old Ethan, was a budding musician, spending hours mastering the piano and guitar, and was known among his friends for his quick wit and loyalty. The youngest, 8-year-old Lily, brought laughter and light into every room she entered. Her boundless curiosity and energy were emblematic of the childhood that her parents had worked so hard to protect and nurture. Their home on 34th Avenue Northwest was the kind of house that embodied stability and warmth. It was filled with family photos, school awards, and the remnants of art projects that Olivia and Ethan brought home from school. The Sullivans had lived there for over a decade, their lives woven tightly into the fabric of the neighborhood. Neighbors described them as quiet, approachable, and remarkably present in the community. Yet beyond the serene exterior, shadows had begun to gather, unnoticed by those around them. In February 2025, a man named Daniel Carrington, 33, moved into a nearby apartment complex. Carrington, born in Portland, Oregon, had a documented history of theft, assault, and reckless behavior. He had spent much of his adult life cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, with repeated arrests for burglary, aggravated assault, and trespassing. Court documents also indicated multiple restraining orders filed by former acquaintances, citing threats and harassment. Carrington presented himself differently to neighbors. Outwardly charming and seemingly polite, he managed to secure a position at a local warehouse and soon began frequenting the neighborhood, often lingering near parks and coffee shops. He showed an unusual interest in the routines of families on 34th Avenue Northwest, casually inquiring about schedules and the comings and goings of children in passing conversations. To the untrained eye, these were harmless interactions, friendly exchanges between neighbors. But in hindsight, these moments were the first steps in a calculated plan. By early March, Carrington had begun tracking the Sullivan family more deliberately. Surveillance cameras captured him loitering near the school where Olivia and Ethan attended, often observing the school buses and noting the time students left and returned. He was seen at the local grocery store, appearing to coincidentally cross paths with Sarah and Lily. To the casual observer, it seemed as though Carrington's presence was incidental, but his movements were intentional, a calculated observation designed to establish patterns and identify vulnerabilities. The first real warning signs occurred on March 14th. Olivia returned from school to find a note slipped under the front door of the Sullivan home. The message was anonymous, cryptic, and threatening. "You don't know me, but I see everything. Be careful who you trust." Sarah assumed it was a prank, an anonymous teen attempting to scare the family, but Michael's instincts told him something was off. He reported it to the local precinct, where officers took the complaint and filed it as a minor harassment case. No immediate danger was identified, and the case was quickly closed, a small piece of paperwork in a sea of unresolved reports. Over the next week, Carrington's actions escalated. Neighbors reported seeing a man loitering outside the house late at night, sometimes at odd hours when the Sullivans were home. Packages were taken from the porch and returned mysteriously. Letters were mailed to the home, unsigned and unnerving in tone, referencing personal details that were clearly private. Each incident, taken individually, seemed minor. Taken together, they painted a picture of growing obsession, but the law enforcement response remained limited, constrained by the lack of concrete evidence and the need for proof beyond suspicion. On March 21, 2025, the Sullivan family went about their day, unaware of how close danger had come. Michael had an early meeting at work. Sarah was preparing for a clinic shift. Olivia had a debate practice, Ethan a piano lesson, and Lily her after-school art club. Everything appeared ordinary, the kind of predictable rhythm that families rely on for comfort. Yet by evening, that rhythm would be shattered in ways that no one could have anticipated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Carrington approached the Sullivan residence. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by investigators, showed him carrying a backpack containing multiple implements that would be used in his plan. He had waited for the moment when the house was minimally occupied, having tracked the schedules of each family member meticulously. At approximately 7:45 p.m., he entered the property, gaining access through an unlocked side door, a door left open due to a forgotten key, a minor oversight that would have catastrophic consequences. What followed over the next several hours would become one of the most meticulously premeditated and horrifying cases in recent American history. The Sullivan family was taken hostage within the confines of their own home. Each family member endured physical and psychological abuse designed to terrorize and dominate. Michael, attempting to protect his children, was restrained and assaulted, sustaining injuries that would require weeks of hospitalization. Sarah was threatened and forced to provide access to family accounts and sensitive personal information. Olivia, Ethan, and Lily were bound in separate rooms, the sounds of their parents' struggle searing into their young minds. By nightfall, the situation escalated further. Carrington, demonstrating an alarming capacity for cruelty and calculation, attempted to coerce Sarah into a withdrawal of large sums of money from the local bank. Surveillance cameras captured his manipulation and the intense psychological pressure placed on the mother, evidence that would later prove critical during the trial. Meanwhile, law enforcement had been alerted by a neighbor who had noticed suspicious activity, and a vehicle registered to Carrington parked near the property for an extended period. Officers arrived within 20 minutes, initiating a standoff that lasted into the early hours of the morning. The night concluded with a violent confrontation, resulting in the death of Carrington and the rescue of the surviving Sullivan family members. Michael, Sarah, and their children sustained physical injuries but survived. The details of the ordeal, later revealed during court proceedings and investigative reporting, were harrowing, exposing a criminal mind that had spent weeks observing, planning, and executing a plan to terrorize and control. As the sun rose over Seattle on March 22nd, the neighborhood awoke to news crews, police barricades, and a community struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the events that had unfolded. The Sullivans, once seen as an emblem of stability and love, had been exposed to the darkest extremes of human behavior. And as authorities began to piece together the chronology of Carrington's actions, the questions that would dominate public discourse became clear. How could someone with a known criminal history escalate to this level of violence? Were there systemic failures that allowed this to occur? And most importantly, how would the family and community begin the slow process of healing from such trauma? In the days following the attack, Seattle was gripped by shock and disbelief. The Sullivan family, though physically recovering, became the center of intense media scrutiny. News outlets, both local and national, descended upon the neighborhood, seeking interviews, statements, and access to the unfolding story. The community, which had once been defined by its serene streets and friendly faces, now bore the heavy weight of collective trauma. Neighbors reported feeling unsafe, schools increased security measures, and parents monitored their children more closely than ever before. The sense of normalcy that had defined the Ballard district was shattered. The police investigation into Daniel Carrington's actions moved swiftly. Detectives combed through surveillance footage from local businesses, neighbors' home security cameras, and traffic cams, piecing together the movements of the perpetrator over several weeks. It became evident that Carrington had studied the Sullivan family obsessively, noting their routines, schedules, and even small habits like which windows were typically left unlocked. Investigators would later describe his behavior as methodical and coldly calculated, a textbook example of premeditation, rarely seen in domestic crimes of this nature. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to document every trace of evidence left behind in the Sullivan home. Fingerprints, fibers, digital records from the home security system, and physical traces on the locks and doors provided an overwhelming amount of material for analysis. The presence of Carrington's DNA in multiple locations within the house confirmed that he had spent significant time in close proximity to the family, a fact that shocked even seasoned investigators. Psychologists and criminal profilers were brought in to assist the law enforcement team. Their analysis painted a disturbing portrait. Daniel Carrington was a man driven by obsession, anger, and a desire for control. Experts noted patterns consistent with previous violent offenders. His history of harassment, burglary, and aggressive behavior, combined with an intense focus on a single family, suggested an escalation that had been inevitable. Profiler interviews revealed that individuals with similar criminal trajectories often fixate on a perceived target, and once an obsession takes hold, it frequently escalates to violence. In Carrington's case, the Sullivan family had become that target. The digital trail left behind by Carrington became a cornerstone of the investigation. Emails, social media messages, and encrypted chats uncovered in his phone revealed a mind consumed by fixation. In one message to a former acquaintance, Carrington wrote, "I watch them because I have to. I need to know everything they do or I can't sleep at night. They can't be allowed to go on without me seeing them." Investigators interpreted this as a declaration of obsessive control, a chilling insight into his mindset. Further evidence indicated he had researched criminal methods, security systems, and escape tactics, demonstrating a level of planning far beyond the impulsive acts of less organized criminals. As the legal case took shape, prosecutors faced a delicate balance. While Carrington had been killed in the confrontation, leaving no opportunity for a traditional trial, there were still questions of civil liability, safety reforms, and potential lapses in oversight that had allowed him to escalate to this point. The district attorney's office launched a review into law enforcement procedures, examining prior arrests and the handling of restraining orders and parole reports, seeking to determine whether systemic failures contributed to the near tragedy. At the same time, the Sullivan family grappled with profound trauma. Michael, recovering from broken ribs and head injuries, struggled to process the hours of fear and helplessness. Sarah endured anxiety and insomnia, reliving the moments when she had felt completely powerless. Olivia, Ethan, and Lily, though unharmed physically, carried the invisible scars of witnessing threats against their parents and experiencing confinement and terror. Therapists and support workers were brought into the home, focusing on trauma recovery, coping mechanisms, and gradually reintegrating the family into public life. Community support played an essential role in the family's recovery. Neighbors organized vigils, fundraisers, and neighborhood watches. Local schools implemented stricter security protocols, including visitor check-ins, emergency drills, and anonymous reporting systems. The broader Seattle community came together to ensure that the Sullivan family was not left isolated. Counseling centers reported a spike in appointments from residents who, though not directly involved, felt the ripple effects of fear and anxiety. In the weeks that followed, public discourse shifted toward policy and prevention. Experts debated how a man with a documented history of violent behavior could approach a family unnoticed for weeks. Questions arose regarding housing regulations, the accessibility of background information for neighbors, and the responsibilities of law enforcement to monitor potentially dangerous individuals in residential areas. City officials held hearings, inviting experts in criminology, psychology, and public safety to discuss reforms aimed at preventing similar cases in the future. Meanwhile, the technological dimension of the case drew national attention. Investigators highlighted how surveillance cameras, home alarms, and community alerts had played a crucial role in limiting the potential for greater tragedy. Analysts noted that, without these systems, Carrington's plan could have had far more devastating outcomes. The case sparked widespread conversations about smart home technology, neighborhood watch apps, and the importance of digital vigilance in modern urban life. Even as the family began to reclaim a sense of normalcy, the psychological impact lingered. Olivia, reflecting on the events in a school essay, wrote, "I learned that fear can be both paralyzing and illuminating. I saw how quickly life can change, and I realized how fragile our sense of safety really is. But I also saw the courage in my parents and the support of our community, and that gave me hope." Professional support for the Sullivan family continued for months. Therapists implemented exposure therapy to reduce lingering anxiety, cognitive behavioral techniques to address intrusive thoughts, and family counseling to rebuild trust and communication. The family's resilience became a focal point in local news stories, showcasing the strength of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. At the same time, law enforcement used the case to educate the public. Workshops and community meetings detailed the warning signs of stalking, the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, and strategies for protecting oneself and one's family. The incident became a case study for police training programs across the country, emphasizing the value of combining digital evidence, eyewitness reports, and behavioral analysis to prevent escalation. The months following the attack also revealed deeper societal concerns. Local journalists investigated Carrington's criminal history and prior interactions with law enforcement, uncovering gaps in monitoring, repeat offenders, and systemic limitations in restraining order enforcement. Editorials called for legislative reform, highlighting the need for more comprehensive approaches to mental health, criminal supervision, and early intervention strategies. These discussions framed the case not just as an isolated tragedy, but as a reflection of vulnerabilities present in many communities. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, the Sullivan family participated in public awareness campaigns on personal safety, sharing their story to educate and inspire others. Michael spoke at city council meetings about the importance of neighborhood vigilance. Sarah advocated for victim support programs, and Olivia and Ethan engaged with schools to discuss the psychological impact of trauma and the importance of resilience. Lily, even at a young age, contributed artwork to memorial events, expressing hope and healing through creative expression. Despite ongoing challenges, the family demonstrated remarkable courage. They worked to reclaim their lives while honoring the lessons learned from the ordeal. Their story became a testament to survival, the importance of community, and the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with calculated violence. As the months unfolded, public interest in the Sullivan case did not wane. Investigators, journalists, and community leaders remained fixated on understanding how such a meticulously planned attack had nearly ended in tragedy. While Daniel Carrington's death during the confrontation meant there would be no criminal trial, the investigative process itself became a matter of intense scrutiny. Every detail of his background, movements, and motivations was examined in painstaking detail to extract lessons that might prevent future attacks. Police reports revealed that Carrington had spent years perfecting his obsession. He had documented the Sullivan family's daily routines in a notebook, sketching diagrams of their home, and even noting patterns of light and shadow in their windows to determine visibility from the street. Authorities described the behavior as obsessive-compulsive and increasingly violent. Mental health professionals consulted by law enforcement noted that Carrington exhibited classic signs of fixation, with early warning behaviors including repeated trespassing, online harassment, and increasingly bold confrontations with neighbors over perceived slights. The neighborhood remained under intense surveillance. Cameras that had previously served only as security measures became integral parts of the investigation, allowing detectives to reconstruct Carrington's steps in almost real time. Neighbors who had once casually waved to each other now reported even minor irregularities: vehicles parked for too long, strangers lingering near homes, or unusual noises at night. This heightened vigilance was both protective and taxing, leaving the community in a state of cautious awareness for months. In the wake of the attack, city officials convened panels of law enforcement experts, psychologists, and civil rights advocates to review protocols for monitoring high-risk individuals. Questions arose regarding the thresholds for intervention, the use of restraining orders, and the limitations of surveillance technology. Discussions highlighted the delicate balance between personal freedom and public safety, emphasizing the complexity of preventing targeted violence without infringing on civil liberties. Media coverage of the Sullivan case was relentless. Every detail, from the family's harrowing experiences to the technological tools that had saved them, was broadcast across television, radio, and digital platforms. Interviews with Michael and Sarah Sullivan were handled cautiously, as the family navigated the dual pressures of trauma and public attention. Local outlets framed the story as a cautionary tale, while national media analyzed it as an example of how obsession and criminal escalation could manifest with devastating consequences. One particularly compelling aspect of the coverage was the exploration of Carrington's psychology. Experts dissected his behavior, explaining that his fixation on the Sullivan family was a form of stalking that had gradually intensified over time. Analysts highlighted warning signs that many families might overlook: repeated minor intrusions, obsessive tracking, and a deep-seated need to control the lives of others. This narrative resonated with viewers nationwide, sparking conversations about personal boundaries, digital monitoring, and the importance of early intervention in potentially dangerous situations. In schools across Seattle, educators used the case as a learning opportunity. Lessons on personal safety, recognizing threats, and digital awareness were integrated into curricula. Guidance counselors held workshops for students on coping with anxiety and fear, while parents were encouraged to discuss stranger danger and the importance of vigilance without inducing panic. The Sullivan children themselves, particularly Olivia and Ethan, became advocates for awareness programs, participating in age-appropriate discussions about trauma, resilience, and community support. Community leaders also emphasized the role of technology in averting greater tragedy. Neighborhood apps, real-time alert systems, and integrated security networks were promoted as essential tools for urban safety. Experts noted that while technology could not prevent every incident, it could provide critical advantages in moments of crisis, allowing law enforcement to respond rapidly and potentially save lives. As the first-year anniversary of the attack approached, the Sullivan family chose to engage publicly, both to honor their survival and to promote awareness. Michael delivered a moving speech at a city council forum, emphasizing the importance of community vigilance and proactive measures. Sarah participated in panels with mental health professionals, discussing trauma recovery, support systems, and the long-term impact of violent encounters. Olivia and Ethan shared their experiences in schools, helping peers understand the psychological effects of trauma while highlighting the importance of seeking help and speaking out. The case also prompted legislative discussions. Lawmakers debated the need for more stringent monitoring of individuals with histories of stalking or violent obsession. Proposals included enhanced reporting systems for restraining orders, mandatory counseling for high-risk individuals, and improved coordination between local police, social services, and mental health agencies. While no immediate legislation was enacted, the discussion set the stage for long-term policy reforms aimed at reducing the likelihood of similar attacks. In private, the Sullivan family continued the slow work of rebuilding their lives. Michael returned to his career, though he now approached his work with a heightened sense of caution and awareness. Sarah focused on community outreach and advocacy, channeling her experiences into programs designed to support victims of violence. The children gradually resumed their school routines, though therapy remained an essential component of daily life. Each family member faced moments of fear and anxiety, yet they also discovered resilience, courage, and the power of familial support. As the media spotlight gradually faded, the Sullivan family chose to focus on long-term recovery and prevention. They partnered with local nonprofits to establish a community safety initiative aimed at educating neighborhoods about recognizing threats, using technology effectively, and supporting victims of violence. The initiative emphasized the importance of community vigilance, neighborly cooperation, and the collective responsibility of citizens in maintaining public safety. Carrington's actions, though violent and tragic, inadvertently sparked a broader conversation about urban safety, mental health awareness, and the necessity of early intervention in cases of obsession and stalking. Researchers and policy analysts cited the Sullivan case in studies on violent escalation, noting that timely intervention, combined with community awareness, could be instrumental in preventing similar tragedies. Through it all, the Sullivan family remained remarkably unified. Their journey underscored the importance of mutual support, open communication, and the ability to find strength even in the aftermath of trauma. As they continued to navigate the complexities of recovery, they became a living testament to human resilience and the capacity to transform personal suffering into a force for societal good. Even with the emotional scars and lingering anxiety, the Sullivans' story resonated as a narrative of survival, courage, and proactive change. They had endured an unimaginable ordeal, yet they emerged committed to helping others, educating their community, and ensuring that the lessons learned from their experience would contribute to a safer, more vigilant society. In the months following the attack, the Sullivan family worked tirelessly to rebuild not only their own lives, but also to ensure their experience would benefit others. The city of Seattle recognized the extraordinary resilience the family displayed and began formally collaborating with them on community safety initiatives. Neighborhood watch programs were expanded, and workshops were developed to educate residents on how to identify suspicious behavior, recognize patterns of stalking, and act decisively to prevent escalation. Michael and Sarah Sullivan were central to these efforts, speaking at city hall meetings, safety conferences, and public forums, sharing first-hand accounts of what had happened and how seemingly ordinary vigilance could make the difference between life and death. Schools, in particular, became a focal point for preventative education. Olivia and Ethan, alongside their parents, participated in age-appropriate discussions on safety, boundaries, and mental health. Guidance counselors incorporated the family story into lessons on dealing with fear, understanding trauma, and recognizing early warning signs of dangerous behavior. Students were encouraged to report any concerning incidents immediately, and workshops taught practical measures such as safe routes to school, use of buddy systems, and the importance of digital privacy. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies began reviewing their protocols in light of the Sullivan case. Police departments across the region examined how quickly they had been able to respond, the efficacy of real-time alert systems, and the coordination between different units. Internal reports emphasized the value of pre-incident planning, data collection, and cross-agency communication. Recommendations included more rigorous tracking of individuals with prior violent behavior, mandatory counseling and monitoring for those exhibiting obsessive tendencies, and enhanced resources for families experiencing harassment or threats. The Sullivan family's ordeal became a case study in law enforcement training programs, illustrating both the dangers of obsession-fueled crimes and the effectiveness of rapid, coordinated intervention. Legislators also took note. The state legislature began drafting bills aimed at improving protections for potential victims of stalking and targeted harassment. Proposals included mandatory reporting systems for repeated harassment, improved access to restraining orders, and increased funding for mental health intervention programs targeting individuals demonstrating obsessive or violent behaviors. Advocates cited the Sullivan case repeatedly, emphasizing that early identification and intervention could prevent a single individual's obsession from turning into a full-scale attack. The family's personal healing journey continued alongside these public efforts. Therapy sessions, family counseling, and community support networks became central pillars of their recovery. Michael, once solely focused on his career, now devoted significant time to mentoring others who had survived traumatic incidents. Sarah became a passionate advocate for trauma-informed mental health programs, particularly those addressing the intersection of obsessive behaviors and criminality. Olivia and Ethan, though still young, found purpose in their roles as peer educators and community ambassadors, using their experiences to empower others to recognize warning signs and seek help. Anniversaries of the attack were difficult, but the family marked each one with acts of remembrance and service. They organized community events focused on safety, education, and resilience. Candlelight vigils were held, bringing together neighbors, friends, and community leaders to honor not only their own survival, but the lives of countless others who had experienced violence. Each event reinforced the central message that vigilance, awareness, and community solidarity were essential tools in preventing tragedy. The Sullivan case also sparked national conversations about urban safety and the psychological factors that lead to violent fixation. Psychologists, criminologists, and policymakers examined Carrington's trajectory, from minor obsessive behaviors to full-scale criminal action, to understand how interventions could occur earlier. Studies highlighted the importance of monitoring behavioral escalation, providing accessible mental health support, and creating legal mechanisms that allow for timely preventative action without infringing on civil liberties. The case became a reference point in academic journals, safety workshops, and legislative hearings, cementing its impact far beyond Seattle. Despite the continued attention, the Sullivans refused to let the incident define them solely as victims. Instead, they framed their narrative around resilience, recovery, and proactive engagement. They launched an online platform providing resources for families, schools, and neighborhoods on preventing, identifying, and responding to stalking and obsessive behaviors. The website included safety checklists, educational videos, real-life case studies, and links to mental health services. The family also partnered with technology companies to enhance neighborhood alert apps, improving response times and communication channels in urban communities. By the second anniversary of the attack, the Sullivan family had become recognized not only for their survival, but also for their transformative contributions to public safety. Their story inspired other communities across the United States to adopt similar safety measures, promote awareness programs, and integrate trauma-informed practices into schools, workplaces, and public services. Media coverage shifted from sensationalized reporting to highlighting practical lessons learned, reinforcing the enduring importance of preparedness, vigilance, and proactive intervention. Michael and Sarah Sullivan, once ordinary residents of a quiet Seattle neighborhood, had now become central figures in a movement that sought to prevent obsession-driven violence. Olivia and Ethan, their children, continue to thrive academically and personally, guided by the values of resilience, courage, and civic responsibility instilled by their parents. The family remained close-knit, channeling the trauma they endured into efforts that strengthened not only their own lives but the fabric of their community. Carrington's life, conversely, became a stark reminder of what can happen when obsession escalates unchecked. His death during the confrontation ended his capacity for further harm, but it also catalyzed long-term initiatives focused on intervention, awareness, and education. Families, schools, law enforcement agencies, and policymakers used the Sullivan case as a blueprint for understanding, preventing, and mitigating the risks posed by dangerous fixations. Years later, the Sullivan family continued to reflect on their journey with a mixture of sorrow, gratitude, and determination. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, yet the legacy of their survival extended far beyond themselves. Through advocacy, education, and community engagement, they transformed a near tragedy into a catalyst for safety, awareness, and resilience. The story of the Sullivans stood as a testament to the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to transform personal trauma into a force for societal good. In the end, the Seattle 2025 attack was remembered not only for the immediate danger it posed, but for the broader conversation it sparked about vigilance, mental health, and community responsibility. The Sullivan family's experience served as both a cautionary tale and a guide, illustrating that while evil may exist in unexpected forms, human resilience, preparedness, and collective action can prevent tragedy from defining the lives of those it touches. Their story became emblematic of hope, recovery, and the enduring impact of proactive engagement in the face of danger, ensuring that the lessons learned would benefit countless others for generations to come. Story 2. It began on an unusually humid evening in late March 2025 in the suburban town of Brookfield, Illinois. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets lined with manicured lawns and identical two-story houses. At first glance, Brookfield appeared like any other American suburb. Families returning from work, children riding bicycles, neighbors greeting one another. But in a modest home on Willow Lane, a darkness had been quietly festering, one that would soon erupt into a crime so shocking it would shake the entire community. The residents of Willow Lane were largely unaware of the drama unfolding in the modest home of the Patel family. Rajesh Patel, 42, was a successful software engineer who had worked for a prominent tech firm in Chicago. Born and raised in suburban Illinois, Rajesh had always been meticulous, often described by colleagues as disciplined and analytical. His wife, Annika Patel, 39, balanced her career as a pediatric nurse with raising their two children. Annika, born in India but raised in the United States, had a nurturing yet firm presence, instilling her children with a strong sense of morality, education, and community responsibility. The Patel children were the pride of their parents' lives. Sanya, 17, was a senior at Brookfield High, a top student with a penchant for science and debate. Her younger brother Arav, 11, was an energetic, curious child, excelling in chess and robotics, often winning local competitions. On that particular evening, the family had gathered for a quiet dinner, discussing Sanya's college applications and Arav's upcoming robotics tournament. The dinner table, polished and orderly, reflected the family's values, a mix of cultural heritage, modern ambition, and genuine care for one another. Unbeknownst to the Patel family, they had already been noticed. Across town, in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Brookfield, two individuals were meticulously planning a crime. Marcus Reed, 28, had a history of burglary and petty theft dating back to his late teens. He had served multiple short-term sentences and was currently on probation for a residential burglary earlier that year. Reed was quiet but calculating, often blending into environments unnoticed, and had recently grown embittered toward society, blaming his misfortunes on perceived injustices. His accomplice, Timothy Tim Kowalski, 35, had a more extensive criminal history. Born and raised in Chicago, Kowalski's criminal record included armed robbery, assault, and fraud. His upbringing had been chaotic, marked by neglect and exposure to violence, which authorities later described as a significant factor contributing to his pattern of aggression. Kowalski was known to be impulsive, often acting without fully considering consequences, but he complemented Reed's methodical planning with his own audacity. The pair had met through a halfway house program that combined probation oversight with job training initiatives. In theory, the program was designed to help rehabilitate offenders and reintegrate them into society. In practice, however, oversight was minimal, and both men found themselves with relative freedom to plan activities outside of structured work hours. By early March, the two had formulated a plan, a home invasion targeting a family they had identified through social media clues, believing the household to be affluent and likely to possess significant cash or valuables. On the evening of March 23, 2025, the Patel family went about their normal routine. Rajesh was reviewing a software architecture document for work. Annika was preparing the final touches of dinner, and Sanya and Arav were discussing Sanya's college essays and the robotics club schedule. Their sense of normalcy was about to be shattered. Reed and Kowalski had conducted surveillance over several days, noting the family's patterns. They observed that the parents often left for short periods in the evenings, the children sometimes alone, and that the house had minimal security measures, no visible cameras, no monitored alarm system, and a single large sliding door at the back that Reed had identified as the most accessible point of entry. Armed with this information, they approached the Patel home that night with a mix of anticipation and dread, the weight of premeditation heavy in their minds. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Reed and Kowalski scaled the backyard fence, remaining concealed in the shadows. The wind rustled through the trees, masking the faint sounds of their movements. Reed carried a small bag with tools for entry, while Kowalski had a crowbar and a flashlight. The plan was simple: gain entry, locate valuables quickly, and leave before being detected. What they did not anticipate, however, was the resolve and intelligence of the family they intended to terrorize. Inside, Rajesh heard an unusual creak on the hardwood floor near the back door. Assuming it might be a pet or a falling branch, he ignored it initially. But the sound repeated, accompanied by a faint shadow passing across the curtain of the sliding door. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a subtle instinct warning him of danger. He whispered to Annika, who immediately suggested locking the doors and ensuring the children were safe. By 9:22 p.m., the intruders had forced open the sliding door. The sound of splintering wood and the faint click of the lock disengaging was enough to alert Rajesh that this was no ordinary noise. Within seconds, Reed and Kowalski were inside the home, masked and gloved. They announced their presence in low, threatening tones, instructing the family not to move. The situation escalated quickly. The calm of Willow Lane shattered as fear and tension filled every corner of the Patel home. Reed first approached the living room, confronting Rajesh. The exchange was brief but violent. Reed struck Rajesh with the butt of a handgun, knocking him to the ground. Meanwhile, Kowalski moved toward the kitchen where Annika was attempting to gather the children and hide them in a safe room she had prepared after attending a personal safety seminar at work. The chaos was immediate. Screams, orders shouted, objects knocked over in panic. Within minutes, Sanya and Arav were cornered. The teenagers had attempted to escape through a small window in their bedroom, but were intercepted by Kowalski. The intruders bound the family with zip ties found in the kitchen, a method they had practiced during prior burglaries. Despite the initial brutality, Annika maintained a calm presence, whispering instructions to her children, urging them to remain quiet and follow her lead, a factor that would later be credited with preventing even greater harm. The invaders then demanded access to valuables, including safes, wallets, and electronic devices. Rajesh, thinking quickly despite a minor concussion from the initial strike, provided the locations of their personal laptops and jewelry boxes. The intruders moved with an unsettling precision, separating the family members, maintaining control through threats and psychological intimidation. By 10:45 p.m., the intruders realized they were not alone. A neighbor's dog had begun barking loudly, triggering a chain of alerts. Reed, fearing detection, ordered Kowalski to hasten the search. The family, sensing an opportunity, coordinated silently, communicating with hand signals and subtle movements to try to alert authorities. The stage was set for an escalating standoff that would last several hours, pushing both the family and intruders into a dangerous interplay of fear, strategy, and desperation. The events of that night would unfold in a way no one could have anticipated, with twists that would challenge law enforcement, test human resilience, and leave lasting scars on the community of Brookfield. As the night deepened, the tension inside the Patel home escalated. By 10:00 p.m., Reed and Kowalski had taken control of the living room, forcing Rajesh to the floor while Annika tried to maintain a calm exterior despite the rising panic in her children's eyes. The intruders' plan, initially simple, a burglary, had quickly morphed into something far more sinister. The men were now improvising, driven by a mix of greed, frustration, and the adrenaline of having been discovered mid-crime. Reed moved toward the hallway where Sanya and Arev were held. Sanya, despite her fear, was calculating. She recognized that survival depended on careful observation and patience. She whispered to her brother, "Stay calm. Don't look at them, just breathe." Arev, barely understanding the gravity of the situation, nodded, trembling but obedient. Their mother, Annika, tried to reassure them, whispering, "We're going to get through this. Just follow my instructions, stay quiet, and don't make sudden moves." Her voice, though soft, carried a strength that seemed to give them a fragile sense of hope. The intruders were methodical but unpredictable. Reed, obsessed with speed, began searching the house for a safe or any hidden cash, demanding that Rajesh provide combinations or passwords to digital accounts. Rajesh, realizing that revealing passwords could compromise financial security long-term, but also fearing immediate violence, feigned ignorance while trying to remain compliant. Kowalski, meanwhile, prowled the bedrooms, growing increasingly agitated by Sanya's steady demeanor. He attempted to intimidate her by banging a metal rod against the door frame, forcing her to flinch, yet she remained composed enough to avoid panicking Arev. Outside, the quiet neighborhood of Brookfield had begun to stir. A neighbor on the opposite side of the street noticed a flicker of light from the Patel home and the silhouette of figures moving unnaturally fast in the backyard. She stepped onto her porch to get a better view, peering through binoculars. The sight of masked men manipulating the sliding door set off an alarm in her mind, and she immediately reached for her phone. Her call to 911 at 10:15 p.m. would prove to be the first lifeline the Patel family had in hours. Inside, the intruders were unaware that law enforcement had been alerted. They continued their search, rifling through drawers, smashing cabinets, and grabbing laptops, jewelry, and cash. Reed, growing increasingly nervous, suggested they take the family with them if necessary. Kowalski, more impulsive, was already making veiled threats, warning that anyone who resisted would be harmed. The psychological strain on the family was immense. Fear, confusion, and the constant uncertainty of what the men might do next created a suffocating atmosphere. Rajesh, despite the concussion and pain from earlier blows, began subtly communicating with the intruders, trying to humanize himself and the family. He spoke about their children, their routines, and the life they had built. Annika, recognizing the potential for persuasion, echoed his words, emphasizing the normalcy of their household and how little cash they actually had. This attempt at reasoning, though risky, was calculated to buy time, to prevent escalation, and to potentially open a path for escape. At 10:40 p.m., Reed found a small safe hidden in the master bedroom closet. As he struggled to open it, he became increasingly frustrated, kicking the door and striking it with a crowbar. The noise, loud and jarring, attracted attention from the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Kowalski's behavior became more erratic. He paced the living room, muttering under his breath, occasionally raising his voice to issue threats to the family. The dynamic between the two criminals was tense. Reed was cautious and methodical, Kowalski volatile and unpredictable. The tension between them only heightened the risk for the family. The 911 dispatcher, now fully engaged, had relayed the situation to Brookfield police units, describing a potential home invasion in progress with armed suspects. Officers began coordinating response strategies, sending multiple patrol cars toward the Patel neighborhood while maintaining caution. They knew from experience that approaching such situations required a balance of speed and care. Any misstep could provoke the intruders into immediate violence. Back inside, Annika noticed that the men were beginning to relax their guard slightly as the night wore on. Reed, engrossed in opening the safe, seemed unaware of the passage of time, while Kowalski, now growing tired and impatient, moved less erratically but remained vigilant. Sensing an opportunity, Annika whispered to Sanya and Arav about a potential escape, instructing them to remember the layout of the house and the positions of the intruders. She knew that a single misstep could provoke immediate retaliation, so her instructions were measured and precise. By 11:15 p.m., the intruders finally forced the safe open, finding a modest sum of cash, a few personal documents, and jewelry. Dissatisfied but unwilling to escalate further without securing some form of loot, they began packing the items into bags. Reed suggested they take the family with them, escalating the situation. Kowalski, still impulsive, argued that leaving the family behind could leave witnesses who would identify them. Their conversation, whispered yet heated, provided the family with critical insight into the men's state of mind. Rajesh seized a brief moment when the intruders were distracted to subtly maneuver toward the staircase leading to a small service door to the backyard. He assessed the feasibility of escape, measuring the distance, the likely line of sight, and the potential obstacles. Simultaneously, Sanya and Arav silently mirrored their parents' movements, preparing to move if the opportunity presented itself. The tension was palpable, every second stretching endlessly. Around 11:35 p.m., Reed and Kowalski decided to move the family to the living room to maintain control while packing their bags. Annika, sensing the critical moment, whispered to Rajesh, "Wait for my signal." The family collectively held their breath, aware that a single sound, a single misstep, could provoke deadly consequences. The psychological toll was immense, but their combined resilience and instinct for survival provided a fragile thread of hope. The first sounds of law enforcement sirens pierced the night air around 11:45 p.m. The intruders reacted instantly, panic replacing their calculated demeanor. Reed cursed under his breath, throwing the packed bags aside, while Kowalski's behavior became erratic. The presence of approaching police had shifted the balance, creating an opportunity for the family to act, but it also escalated the immediate danger. Annika, assessing the situation, gave a quiet signal to Rajesh. Within moments, he lunged toward the service door while Sanya and Arav followed his lead. The family moved as one, careful to avoid making noise, slipping through the backyard gate and into the shadows. Reed and Kowalski, realizing the family was attempting to flee, gave chase, shouting threats but hesitating as the distant sirens grew louder. By 11:50 p.m., the Patel family had reached the neighbor's yard, breathless, panicked, but intact. The neighbor who had called 911 earlier immediately welcomed them in, closing the door to block visibility from the street. The family collapsed inside, shaken, their relief tempered by the knowledge that the intruders were still nearby, and that danger was not yet fully resolved. Police vehicles arrived moments later, surrounding the Patel home. Officers, equipped with tactical gear and flashlights, approached carefully, issuing loud commands for anyone inside to surrender. Reed and Kowalski, cornered and desperate, attempted to flee, but were quickly apprehended in a brief pursuit within the property boundaries. Both men were taken into custody without incident, although the tension in the air remained thick with the adrenaline and fear that had gripped the neighborhood for hours. By midnight, the Patel family was safe, escorted by law enforcement to a secure location. Emergency responders treated minor injuries and provided psychological support, understanding the profound trauma the family had endured. The scene of the crime, disrupted furniture, broken locks, scattered valuables, was preserved for investigators, who began meticulous evidence collection, including fingerprint analysis, digital forensics, and statements from neighbors and the family. In the days that followed, the Patel case became a focal point for local news and social media. Community members expressed shock and concern that such violence could erupt in a seemingly safe suburb. Law enforcement praised the family's composure and quick thinking, particularly Annika's ability to guide her children under extreme duress. Reed and Kowalski were charged with multiple felonies, including home invasion, assault, unlawful restraint, and attempted robbery, facing decades of imprisonment if convicted. The Brookfield Police Department, reflecting on the incident, identified several key lessons. Community vigilance, early 911 reporting, and proactive family safety measures had played critical roles in preventing loss of life. The Patel family, meanwhile, became advocates for home safety awareness, speaking publicly about their experience and emphasizing preparedness, communication, and resilience in the face of violence. As dawn broke over Brookfield, the quiet streets bore little resemblance to the chaos of the night before. Yellow police tape still cordoned off the Patel residence, patrol cars remained stationed at either end of the block, and neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering in disbelief. What had happened inside that house would ripple outward for months, reshaping not just one family's life, but the sense of safety of an entire community. Rajesh sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket, answering questions from a detective whose voice was calm and deliberate. Annika sat nearby with Sanya and Arav, holding both children close as a victim advocate gently explained what would happen next. The children had barely spoken since the escape. Sanya stared straight ahead, her expression blank but alert, while Arav clutched a stuffed toy someone had found in the neighbor's house, his small fingers gripping it as though it were an anchor to reality. Inside the Patel home, forensic teams worked methodically. Every surface was photographed, every footprint cataloged, every broken lock and overturned drawer documented. The damage told a story of escalating desperation. Reed's fingerprints were found on the crowbar, the safe, the kitchen counter where he had leaned while shouting demands. Kowalski's prints were everywhere else, smudged and erratic, consistent with his restless pacing. Blood droplets near the entryway confirmed where Rajesh had been struck during the initial confrontation. By mid-morning, the identities of the suspects were confirmed. Ethan Reed, 37, had a criminal record that spanned 2 states, including burglary, fraud, and a recent violation of probation. Lucas Kowalski, 34, had a history of violent offenses, including assault and weapons charges, and had been released from prison less than a year earlier. Both men had drifted between short-term jobs and unstable housing, a pattern that investigators recognized all too well. At the Brookfield Police Department, Reed and Kowalski were interrogated separately. Reed attempted to maintain a veneer of rationality, insisting that the plan had never been meant to hurt anyone, that things had gotten out of hand. His narrative shifted repeatedly as detectives confronted him with evidence, from surveillance footage to witness statements. Kowalski, by contrast, oscillated between silence and bursts of anger. At one point, he slammed his fists on the interrogation table, shouting that the family had made things worse by trying to escape. That moment, captured on video, would later become a central piece of evidence demonstrating his lack of remorse. The charges were announced that afternoon. Multiple counts of aggravated home invasion, armed robbery, unlawful restraint, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy. Prosecutors made it clear that they would seek maximum sentences. The case, unfolding in real time, quickly drew national attention. News outlets framed it as another example of how quickly routine burglaries could turn into life-threatening ordeals. Commentators debated sentencing laws, parole decisions, and the broader failures that allowed repeat offenders to remain on the streets. For the Patel family, the public attention was overwhelming. They were relocated to a temporary safe house while repairs were made to their home and security upgrades installed. Nights were the hardest. Annika found herself waking at the slightest sound, her heart racing, instinctively checking the doors and windows. Rajesh struggled with guilt, replaying the moment he had been struck, wondering if he could have done more, acted faster, protected his family better. Sanya began having nightmares, waking up gasping, while Arev refused to sleep alone, insisting on staying in his parents' room. Therapists explained that these reactions were normal, expected responses to trauma. Healing, they said, would not be linear. There would be progress and setbacks, moments of strength followed by sudden fear. The family committed to therapy together, determined not to let the night define the rest of their lives, even as its shadow lingered over everything they did. 3 weeks later, Reed and Kowalski appeared in court for their preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks ready, cameras positioned outside. The Patel family sat together, supported by relatives and friends. When Reed was led in, he avoided eye contact, staring at the floor. Kowalski, however, scanned the room until his eyes landed briefly on Annika and the children. The look he gave them was cold, defiant, and fleeting, but it was enough to make Annika's stomach turn. Prosecutors laid out the sequence of events in meticulous detail. The neighbor's 911 call, the forced entry, the threats, the discovery of stolen items packed for removal, the attempted restraint of the family, the escape, the arrests. Each fact was supported by evidence, each claim reinforced by testimony. When the judge ruled that there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial, there was no surprise, only a quiet sense of inevitability. As the case moved toward trial, investigators continued to uncover details about the suspect's movements in the weeks leading up to the crime. Cell phone data showed that Reed and Kowalski had driven through several affluent neighborhoods, likely scouting potential targets. Online searches revealed queries about alarm systems, response times, and even phrases like "best time to break into a house." The narrative of a spontaneous crime collapsed completely under the weight of evidence showing planning and intent. The trial began in early autumn, nearly 9 months after the night of the invasion. By then, the Patel family had returned to their home, though it felt different. New locks, reinforced doors, and security cameras provided some comfort, but the sense of innocence was gone. Every creak of the floorboards carried meaning. Every unexpected sound triggered a moment of hesitation. In court, the prosecution called witness after witness. The neighbor who had made the 911 call described the moment she realized something was wrong, her voice trembling as she recalled the fear of not knowing if help would arrive in time. The responding officers testified about the arrest, the tension of approaching the house, the relief when they learned the family had escaped. Forensic experts walked the jury through the physical evidence, connecting each piece to the actions of the defendants. Then it was Annika's turn to testify. She spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting the intrusion, the threats, the fear in her children's eyes. At one point, her voice wavered as she described whispering instructions to Sanya and Arav, knowing that any mistake could cost them their lives. The courtroom was silent. Even the defendant sat still. When she finished, there were tears in the eyes of several jurors. Rajesh followed, describing the blow to his head, the pain, and the helplessness of being unable to protect his family in that moment. He spoke candidly about the guilt he carried, and about the resilience his family had found in each other afterward. His testimony reinforced the human cost of the crime in a way that no piece of evidence ever could. The defense attempted to argue that no one had been seriously injured, that the family had escaped, that the situation had not escalated to its worst possible outcome. Prosecutors dismantled that argument with a simple truth. The absence of death did not negate the presence of intent. The law, they reminded the jury, existed to punish not just what happened, but what could have happened and nearly did. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the verdicts were unanimous. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. Reed showed little reaction as the verdicts were read. Kowalski shook his head, muttering under his breath, until the judge warned him to remain silent. Sentencing took place a month later. Victim impact statements filled the courtroom with raw emotion. Annika spoke of fear, of resilience, of the determination to reclaim her family's sense of safety. Sanya, her voice steady but quiet, spoke of the night she learned how fragile life could be. Arav's statement was read by his mother. It was short, simple, and devastating. "I want to sleep without being scared," it said. The judge sentenced Reed to 38 years in prison. Kowalski received 45, reflecting his violent history and lack of remorse. As the gavel fell, there was no applause, no celebration. Only a sense of closure, partial and imperfect, but necessary. Outside the courthouse, Annika spoke briefly to reporters. She thanked the neighbors, the police, and the community. She emphasized that vigilance and compassion had saved her family's lives. "We survived," she said, "not because we were fearless, but because people cared enough to act." The story did not end with the sentencing. In the months that followed, the Patel family worked to transform their trauma into purpose. They partnered with local organizations to promote home safety education, encouraged neighbors to look out for one another, and advocated for stronger support systems for victims of violent crime. Brookfield, too, changed. Neighborhood watch programs expanded. Police-community relationships deepened. The illusion of perfect safety was gone, replaced by something more grounded and more real: awareness. Yet even as life slowly resumed its rhythm, the memory of that night remained. Trauma does not vanish with verdicts or sentences. It lingers, reshapes, demands acknowledgement. For the Patels, healing was ongoing, marked by small victories and quiet strength. What had begun as an ordinary evening in 2025 had become a defining chapter in their lives. A reminder that darkness can arrive without warning, but also that courage, vigilance, and community can push back against it. And while the scars would never fully fade, they stood as proof of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of a family who refused to be defined by the worst night of their lives. In the months after the sentencing, life did not simply return to what it had been before. Instead, it settled into something quieter, more deliberate, shaped by a constant awareness that safety was no longer an abstract concept but a daily practice. For the Patel family, healing unfolded in fragments, not milestones. There was no moment when fear disappeared entirely, only moments when it loosened its grip. Winter arrived early that year, covering Brookfield in snow and muffling the streets in a deceptive calm. Annika found herself standing at the kitchen window one evening, watching snow fall under the glow of a streetlight, realizing how different her sense of peace had become. Before, silence had meant rest. Now, silence demanded vigilance. She had learned to sit with that contradiction, to breathe through it instead of fighting it. Rajesh returned to work gradually, his colleagues careful not to overwhelm him with questions. Some avoided the topic altogether, unsure of what to say. Others expressed anger on his behalf, talking about what they wished had happened to the intruders. Rajesh listened politely but felt disconnected from that rage. What consumed him instead were quieter thoughts. What if the neighbor hadn't noticed the movement? What if the sirens had arrived minutes later? These questions surfaced uninvited, especially in the early hours of the morning. Sanya's recovery took a different shape. At school, teachers noticed she had become more observant, more reserved. She sat near exits, scanned rooms instinctively, and flinched at raised voices. Yet beneath that caution was a sharpened sense of empathy. She gravitated toward classmates who were struggling, who seemed invisible. Her counselor described it as post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon where surviving fear deepened her awareness of others' pain. Sanya didn't have language for it. She just knew she never wanted anyone to feel as helpless as she had that night. Arev's healing was the most fragile. Loud noises startled him. Nightmares came in waves, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes night after night. He asked questions no child should have to ask. Why did they come into our house? Why didn't they just leave? Why do people hurt other people? Annika answered honestly but gently, emphasizing that what happened was not his fault, that most people were good, and that sometimes bad choices had terrible consequences. The community of Brookfield did not forget. Months later, neighbors still checked in, still waved a little longer than before, still noticed unfamiliar cars. The local police department held town halls focused on crime prevention, not out of panic, but out of responsibility. Officers spoke candidly about response times, situational awareness, and the importance of calling for help even when uncertainty lingered. The Patel case had become a reference point, a reminder of how close normalcy and catastrophe could exist. On the first anniversary of the home invasion, Annika debated whether to mark the day or let it pass unnoticed. In the end, the family chose something simple. They cooked dinner together, a meal that took time and attention, filling the house with familiar smells. There were no speeches, no heavy reflections, just presence, just proof that they were still here. That night, Rajesh locked the doors as he always did, checked the security system, and then paused. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the familiar spike of anxiety afterward. Habit remained, but the fear had softened. He realized then that survival was not a single event. It was a series of choices made every day afterward. Elsewhere, in separate correctional facilities, Ethan Reed and Lucas Kowalski adjusted to the reality of long sentences. Appeals were filed, as they always were, but legal experts privately acknowledged that the chances of reversal were slim. The evidence was overwhelming. The narrative was clear. The justice system, for once, had moved decisively. Reed reportedly kept to himself, avoiding trouble, focusing on routines that made time pass more quickly. Kowalski struggled. His defiance faded into frustration, then bitterness. Correctional officers noted his difficulty adjusting to authority, his resentment toward a world that had moved on without him. Neither man would ever again walk freely through a quiet neighborhood at night. The broader impact of the case extended beyond Brookfield. National discussions resurfaced about sentencing, rehabilitation, and the warning signs that precede violent crimes. Commentators debated whether the system focused too heavily on punishment and not enough on prevention. Others argued that no amount of policy could eliminate human cruelty entirely. The Patel case became one more data point in a long, unresolved conversation. For Annika, those debates felt distant. Her world was smaller, more immediate. It was about getting Arav to sleep through the night, about watching Sanya laugh with friends again, about sitting beside Rajesh on the couch, holding his hand in silence that no longer felt threatening. There were setbacks. Anniversaries triggered memories. Court documents arriving in the mail reignited old fears. But there was progress, too. A family vacation taken without constant scanning of exits. A night when Arav slept alone in his room without waking in terror. A moment when Annika realized she had gone an entire afternoon without thinking about that night at all. Survival had not made them fearless. It had made them intentional. They spoke openly about boundaries, about trust, about awareness. They did not hide the truth from their children, but they refused to let fear define their future. The story that began as a headline in 2025 gradually receded from public attention, replaced by newer tragedies, newer debates. But for those who lived it, it remained etched into memory, not as a singular moment of terror, but as a turning point. It was the night they learned how quickly life could fracture, and it was the long aftermath in which they learned how deliberately it could be rebuilt. In that rebuilding, there was no grand victory, no perfect ending, only resilience, only the quiet determination to keep living, to keep choosing connection over fear, and to remember that even in the face of violence, humanity could still assert itself in small, powerful ways. And so the Patel family moved forward, not untouched but unbroken, carrying with them the truth that survival is not just about escaping danger, but about reclaiming life afterward, one ordinary day at a time. Story 3. On a warm spring evening in May 2025, the quiet suburb of Lakewood Hills, just outside Columbus, Ohio, settled into its usual rhythm. Lawns were freshly cut, porch lights flickered on one by one, and families moved through familiar routines that felt permanent in their predictability. It was the kind of neighborhood where people believed serious crime happened somewhere else, to someone else. That belief would not survive the night. The Collins family had lived on Red Maple Drive for nearly 12 years. Mark Collins was 46, a senior project manager for a regional construction firm, known among colleagues as steady and dependable. He was the kind of man who believed problems could always be solved with enough planning and discipline. His wife, Rebecca, 43, worked part-time as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic and spent the rest of her time juggling school schedules, volunteer commitments, and the emotional glue that held the household together. Their children, 16-year-old Olivia and 9-year-old Ethan, had grown up on that street, riding bikes in looping circles and knocking on neighbors' doors without fear. To outsiders, the Collins family looked unremarkable in the best possible way. They attended school events, hosted backyard barbecues, and waved at neighbors during evening walks. There were no visible cracks. No one could have guessed that beneath the surface, the family was under a strain that had been quietly intensifying for more than a year. In late 2023, Mark's company had lost several major contracts. By early 2024, layoffs followed. Mark survived the first round, then the second. By the third, his position was eliminated entirely. He told Rebecca calmly, almost clinically, that it was temporary. He would find something else. He always did. But weeks turned into months and the job market did not respond to his confidence. By the start of 2025, savings had thinned. Credit cards filled the gap. Mark began taking contract work well below his previous level, telling no one how humiliating it felt to go from managing million-dollar projects to bidding for short-term consulting gigs. Rebecca sensed the tension but didn't press. She had learned that Mark processed stress inwardly, retreating rather than venting. She believed that patience was support. Olivia noticed the change first. Her father was quieter, more irritable. Small things set him off. A late dinner, a misplaced charger. She chalked it up to adult stress and focused on her own world, college applications looming like a constant pressure. Ethan, younger and less perceptive, sensed only that his father was less playful, less present. On May 17th, 2025, the day began like any other Saturday. Rebecca worked a morning shift at the clinic. Olivia met friends at a cafe downtown. Ethan had a soccer game at the local park. Mark stayed home, telling Rebecca he wanted to catch up on emails and prepare for an interview scheduled for the following week. He kissed her goodbye and waved as Ethan left with a teammate's parent. What no one knew was that the interview Mark mentioned didn't exist. Sometime late that morning, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a legal pad filled with notes. His bank account balances were pulled up on the screen. Numbers stared back at him, unyielding. Overdraft warnings, payment reminders, a foreclosure notice draft he had saved but not yet received. He closed the laptop and stared at the wall for a long time, his thoughts looping inward. Neighbors later told police they saw Mark working in the garage that afternoon, cleaning, organizing, disposing of old boxes. It seemed normal, even productive. Around 3:00 p.m. he drove to a local hardware store. Surveillance footage would later show him walking the aisles slowly, deliberately. He purchased duct tape, heavy-duty trash bags, and a new extension cord. The cashier remembered him because he paid in cash and declined a receipt. By early evening, Rebecca returned home. Dinner was quiet but not tense. Mark asked about her day. Ethan talked excitedly about scoring a goal. Olivia scrolled through her phone, half listening. The family ate together as they often did. Afterward, Rebecca went upstairs to shower. Olivia retreated to her room to video chat with friends. Ethan spread his toys across the living room floor. At 8:42 p.m., a neighbor's security camera captured Mark stepping outside to take out the trash. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, looking up and down the street. Porch lights glowed softly. Somewhere down the block, laughter drifted through an open window. He went back inside. What happened next would take investigators months to reconstruct and a jury less than 2 weeks to believe. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Rebecca was in the bedroom, folding laundry, when Mark entered and closed the door behind him. He told her they needed to talk. She smiled, thinking it was about finances, maybe an apology for being distant. She would never get the chance to respond. The sound that followed was not heard by neighbors. The house absorbed it the way suburban homes often do, insulating private lives from outside interference. By the time Olivia removed her headphones, sensing something was wrong but unable to articulate why, it was already too late. At 10:03 p.m., a 911 call came in from Red Maple Drive. The caller did not speak at first. There was heavy breathing, then a voice, strained and unfamiliar, saying only, "I need help, please, I need help." When police arrived minutes later, the front door was unlocked. The lights were on. What they found inside would haunt the department for years. This was not a crime of intrusion. There was no forced entry, no sign of an external threat. The danger had come from within. By midnight, Red Maple Drive was flooded with patrol cars, crime scene vans, and stunned neighbors wrapped in blankets. Yellow tape cut through the familiar geometry of the street, transforming it into something unrecognizable. The Collins family, once indistinguishable from dozens of others in Lakewood Hills, had become the center of a tragedy that would soon ripple far beyond their quiet suburb. And this was only the beginning. By the time detectives finished their initial sweep of the house, the reality of what had unfolded inside became impossible to soften. The Collins home was orderly, almost meticulously so, which only heightened the brutality of the violence. Nothing had been overturned in a struggle. No signs of forced entry. No indication of a break-in gone wrong. Every detail pointed inward, toward a single devastating conclusion. Rebecca Collins was found in the upstairs bedroom. The room was dimly lit, the bedside lamp still on, casting a warm glow that felt grotesquely out of place. She lay near the foot of the bed, her body positioned in a way that suggested surprise rather than resistance. The medical examiner would later note injuries consistent with ligature strangulation. There were no defensive wounds. Investigators believed she had been attacked quickly, without warning, likely while she was still processing what her husband had told her moments earlier. Down the hall, in Olivia's room, police found the teenager seated against her bed, her phone shattered on the floor nearby. Evidence suggested she had attempted to run. Scratch marks on the doorframe indicated panic, confusion, a desperate attempt to escape a reality she could not comprehend. She had been overpowered within seconds. The cruelty of that realization weighed heavily on every officer who stepped into the room. Ethan was found in the living room, his toys still scattered across the carpet. The television was paused on a children's program. His small body lay near the couch, wrapped partially in one of the heavy-duty trash bags Mark had purchased that afternoon. Even seasoned investigators struggled to remain composed at that scene. Several stepped outside to collect themselves, staring at the familiar suburban street as if trying to reconcile it with what they had just seen. Mark Collins was found alive. He was seated at the kitchen table, hands zip-tied behind his back, a shallow cut across his forearm bleeding onto the tiled floor. The injury was superficial, carefully placed. When officers entered, he looked up slowly, his expression blank, almost relieved. He did not resist arrest. He did not cry. He asked for water. The 911 call, investigators would later determine, had been placed by Mark himself. At the station, Mark was read his rights. He acknowledged them calmly, nodding along as if this were another procedural meeting he needed to sit through. Detectives noted his affect immediately. There was no hysteria, no visible shock, just an unsettling stillness. The interview began shortly after 2:00 a.m. Mark spoke in measured sentences. He described months of financial stress, feelings of failure, the weight of expectations he believed he could no longer meet. He framed his actions in language that sounded rehearsed, almost philosophical. He said he believed his family was better off not facing what was coming. He said he didn't want them to suffer. He said he wanted to protect them. When detectives asked him to clarify what he meant by what was coming, he hesitated for the first time. His eyes dropped to the table. He spoke about debt, about foreclosure, about humiliation, about losing respect. He did not speak about violence. He did not speak about the reality of what he had done. At one point, a detective slid a photograph across the table, face down. He warned Mark before turning it over. The image showed the living room, frozen in the aftermath of what Mark insisted on calling a decision. Mark looked at the photograph for a long time. His breathing changed, but his expression did not break. He pushed the photo back across the table and said quietly, "I didn't want them to be afraid." That sentence would later become one of the most quoted lines in the entire case. By morning, news of the crime spread rapidly. Helicopters hovered over Lakewood Hills. National outlets picked up the story, drawn by the familiar but horrifying narrative of a suburban family destroyed from within. Reporters camped outside police headquarters, neighbors' homes, and the local school district offices. Social media filled with speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Friends of the Collins family struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster described in police reports. Coworkers defended Mark's character. Others recalled moments of anger, flashes of bitterness that had seemed insignificant at the time. Rebecca's colleagues spoke of her kindness, her patience, her devotion to her children. Olivia's friends left flowers outside the school gates. Ethan's soccer team tied green ribbons to the goalposts at the field where he had played just hours before his death. As the investigation deepened, detectives began piecing together a clearer timeline. Mark's search history revealed weeks of late-night browsing, articles about life insurance policies, discussions on online forums about debt, masculinity, and failure. Phrases like family annihilator psychology appeared in his search bar, buried among job listings and financial calculators. Financial records confirmed the depth of his desperation. Maxed out credit cards, missed mortgage payments, a retirement account drained almost entirely. But there was no imminent eviction, no foreclosure scheduled, no final notice that would have forced immediate action. The crisis Mark described existed, but it was not as absolute as he believed. To investigators, this distinction mattered. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution described Mark's mindset as catastrophizing, a cognitive distortion where perceived failure eclipses all other possibilities. They explained how individuals who tie their identity entirely to control and provision can experience financial instability as existential annihilation. When that identity collapses, empathy collapses with it. Still, explanations did not equal excuses. The Franklin County prosecutor announced formal charges 3 days later: 4 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of felonious assault related to the staged injury. No plea deals would be offered. The state would seek life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At the arraignment, Mark appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled. He did not look toward the gallery, where Rebecca's parents sat clutching each other, their faces hollowed by grief. He pleaded not guilty, his attorney citing mental health factors and extreme emotional distress. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was divided between silence and fury. Some held signs demanding justice. Others stood quietly, holding photographs of Rebecca, Olivia, and Ethan. There were no chants, no shouting. The weight of the crime seemed to suppress even anger. As the legal process began its slow march forward, one question echoed relentlessly through the community and beyond. How could a man so deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary life commit something so irrevocably violent without anyone stopping him? The answer, investigators knew, would not be simple, and the trial had not yet begun. As the case moved toward trial, the narrative surrounding Mark Collins began to fracture into competing interpretations, each more unsettling than the last. To the prosecution, this was a calculated act of control, a man who decided that if his life was unraveling, he would decide how and when his family's lives ended. To the defense, it was a psychological collapse, a slow-burning implosion fueled by fear, shame, and untreated mental illness. To the public, it was something far harder to accept, proof that unimaginable violence could exist behind the most ordinary doors. The discovery phase revealed a deeper, more troubling portrait of Mark's inner world. Prosecutors subpoenaed his work emails, private messages, and therapy records from years prior. What emerged was not a sudden break but a long pattern of emotional isolation. Colleagues described him as dependable but distant, a man who rarely spoke about his personal life unless prompted. He was known for staying late, for taking on extra responsibilities without complaint. But behind that outward competence was a growing resentment, one he never voiced aloud. Rebecca's journals, recovered from a nightstand drawer, added another dimension. She wrote about sensing Mark's withdrawal, about feeling like she was living beside someone who was already gone. She worried about his pride, about how deeply he internalized every setback. In one entry dated just weeks before her death, she wrote that she had suggested counseling again, and that Mark had dismissed it, saying, "I just need to fix things." Fixing things, it seemed, had become synonymous with control. Witness testimony painted the days leading up to the murders in stark detail. On the Thursday before the killings, Mark attended Olivia's school performance. Parents remembered him smiling, clapping, filming the event on his phone. He hugged his daughter afterward and told her how proud he was. On Friday, he helped Ethan practice spelling words at the kitchen table. On Saturday morning, he took the kids to a park while Rebecca ran errands. There was no visible rupture, no warning flare that screamed catastrophe. That normalcy would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Forensic analysis confirmed that Mark had waited until the house was quiet, until the rhythms of his family's lives aligned into a moment he could predict. The medical examiner testified that Rebecca's death occurred first, likely to prevent her from intervening. Olivia was next, Ethan last. The sequence was deliberate. The pauses between acts suggested reflection, not frenzy. During pretrial hearings, the defense introduced psychiatric evaluations diagnosing Mark with major depressive disorder and acute stress reaction. Experts testified that he had experienced a psychological narrowing, a tunnel vision where he believed he was eliminating future suffering. The prosecution countered with their own experts, who emphasized Mark's planning, his efforts to stage the scene, his calculated injury. They argued that while he may have been distressed, he was not detached from reality. He knew exactly what he was doing. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives, each side presenting a version of Mark Collins that felt incomplete on its own. Jurors listened to hours of testimony about brain chemistry, cognitive distortions, and moral agency. They watched surveillance footage of Mark calmly purchasing supplies. They heard the 911 call again and again, analyzing every pause, every breath. One moment in the trial would come to define public perception. A prosecutor asked a detective to read aloud a text message Mark had sent to himself, saved in the Notes app on his phone just hours before the murders. It read, "This is the only way to stop the fall." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rebecca's parents took the stand later that week. Her mother spoke about Rebecca's optimism, her belief that problems were meant to be faced together. Her father described teaching Olivia how to ride a bike, how Ethan used to sit on his shoulders during parades. Neither addressed Mark directly. They spoke instead to the absence left behind, the void that no sentence could fill. Outside the courtroom, debates raged. Commentators argued about masculinity, financial pressure, and the silent expectations placed on men to be providers at all costs. Mental health advocates warned against oversimplification, against using diagnosis as a shield or a weapon. Victims' rights groups pushed back, emphasizing that understanding motive should never dilute accountability. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution returned to a single, unrelenting point. Mark Collins had options. He had support. He had time. What he chose instead was finality. The defense asked the jury to consider the human cost of untreated mental illness, to see Mark not as a monster but as a broken man who believed, tragically and wrongly, that he was sparing his family pain. When the jury retired to deliberate, the community held its breath. The house on Lakewood Hills Drive remained boarded up, flowers long since wilted, the ribbons faded. Inside, the echoes of ordinary life had been replaced by silence. No verdict could restore what had been lost. No explanation could make sense of it. But justice, imperfect and slow, was about to speak. The verdict came on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that seemed suspended between seasons. The jury filed back into the courtroom with expressions carefully neutral, though several could not avoid glancing toward the defense table. Mark Collins stood when instructed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his shoulders rigid. He did not look toward the gallery where Rebecca's parents sat holding each other's hands, their faces drawn with a grief that had long since moved past tears. The foreperson's voice was steady as each count was read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. With each word, the air seemed to thicken. Mark did not react outwardly. No collapse, no visible anger, no tears. Only a slow exhale, as if something heavy he had been holding for months had finally been set down. When the final count was read, the judge thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the emotional toll of what they had endured. Several jurors wiped their eyes as they were dismissed, avoiding the cameras that waited outside. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, a delay that felt unbearable to the families involved. In that time, victim impact statements were prepared, psychiatric evaluations finalized, and arguments refined. Mark was transferred to a state facility, placed on suicide watch, monitored around the clock. Guards reported that he was quiet, compliant, spending most of his time staring at the wall or reading the same paperback novel over and over again. He asked once about his children. The question was met with silence. At sentencing, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Reporters lined the walls. Mental health advocates sat beside victims' rights supporters, two groups often positioned in opposition, now sharing the same space in uneasy proximity. The judge entered, and the room stood as one. Rebecca's mother spoke first. Her voice trembled but did not break. She spoke about the last time she saw her daughter, about a casual goodbye that replayed endlessly in her mind. She spoke Olivia's name, then Ethan's, pausing after each as if to give them space to exist in the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not curse. She simply described the absence that had consumed every corner of her life. Rebecca's father followed. He spoke less, his words sparse and heavy. He said he would never forgive Mark Collins, but forgiveness, he added, was no longer the point. Nothing, he said, will ever make this make sense. When it was Mark's turn to speak, the courtroom leaned forward almost imperceptibly. He stood slowly, his hands shaking. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that words meant nothing. He said he lived every moment in the aftermath of what he had done, waking each day to the same realization, the same irreversible truth. He spoke about fear, about feeling like he was drowning, about believing he was protecting his family from a future he could no longer imagine surviving. He acknowledged that belief was wrong, catastrophically wrong. I didn't save them, he said. I destroyed them. The judge listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Mark finished, the judge spoke with a measured firmness that left no ambiguity. He acknowledged the role of mental illness, but rejected the idea that it diminished responsibility. He spoke about choice, about the sanctity of life, about the particular horror of violence inflicted on those who trust us most. Mark Collins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As deputies led him away, he finally looked toward the gallery. Rebecca's parents did not meet his gaze. The courtroom emptied slowly, people leaving in silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. Outside, life continued. Cars passed, people checked their phones. Somewhere, children laughed. In the months that followed, the case became a reference point in broader conversations about mental health, financial pressure, and the hidden crises that unfold behind closed doors. Articles dissected warning signs. Experts debated prevention strategies. Legislators proposed reforms. None of it brought comfort to those who had known Rebecca, Olivia, and Ethan not as symbols but as people. The house on Lakewood Hills Drive was eventually sold, renovated, repainted, new curtains hung in the windows. A family moved in, unaware at first of the history, or aware but determined to reclaim the space. The echoes faded, though they never vanished entirely. Rebecca's parents started a foundation in their grandchildren's names, funding counseling services for families in crisis. They spoke at schools, at conferences, their grief transformed into something that reached outward instead of collapsing inward. It did not heal them. Nothing could, but it gave their pain a shape. Mark Collins would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls, his days measured by routines he did not choose. There would be no redemption arc, no revelation that could undo what he had done. Only time. Endless, unyielding time. And somewhere beyond the walls of courtrooms and prisons, the question lingered as it always does in cases like this. How does something so ordinary become something so catastrophic? How does love twist into destruction? How many quiet warnings go unnoticed before silence turns permanent? There were no answers that satisfied. Only a story that ended where it began, with a family that should have been safe, a future that should have existed, and a truth that could not be undone. Story 4. The night the city lost its breath began like countless others, with neon reflecting off wet pavement and the low hum of traffic weaving through narrow streets. In early March of 2025, Seoul was shaking off winter, the air still sharp but threaded with the promise of spring. People lingered longer outside cafes. Couples walked shoulder to shoulder along the Han River, and apartment windows glowed with the soft blue light of televisions winding down for the night. Nothing about that evening suggested it would soon be remembered for something far darker. Inside a high-rise complex in Mapo district, a woman named Han Seo-yeon prepared for bed. At 34, she had built a life that looked, from the outside, quietly successful. She worked as a senior project coordinator for a digital marketing firm, a job that demanded precision, late nights, and an unspoken tolerance for stress. Her apartment was tidy but lived in, decorated with neutral tones and framed photos from weekend hikes and family gatherings. On her kitchen counter sat a half-finished cup of barley tea, now cold. Seo-yeon checked her phone one last time. There were no new messages from her husband, Park Min-yi. That in itself was not unusual. Min-yi worked irregular hours as a freelance videographer, often editing late into the night. What unsettled her was the silence stretching back nearly 24 hours. His last message, sent the previous evening, had been brief and oddly formal. "I'll be busy tomorrow. Don't wait up." She told herself not to overthink it. She had learned, over years of marriage, that Min-yi retreated when he felt overwhelmed. Giving him space was easier than confronting him, easier than opening conversations that often ended in exhaustion rather than resolution. Still, as she turned off the lights and lay in bed, a faint unease pressed against her thoughts. Across the river, in a low-rise building near a converted warehouse district, Min-yi sat alone in a dim editing studio he rented by the hour. The space smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee. Multiple monitors glowed in front of him, though the footage on screen remained paused, untouched for hours. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping in an irregular rhythm. He had not come here to work. Min-yi was 37, lean, with the kind of face that looked perpetually thoughtful even when blank. Friends described him as introspective, creative, sometimes distant. In the early years of his marriage, that distance had been mistaken for depth. Over time, it had become something heavier, more isolating. On the desk beside him lay his phone, face down. Notifications vibrated intermittently, then stopped. He did not pick it up. What no one else knew, what even Seo-yeon could only sense but never fully grasp, was how completely Min-yi felt his life had narrowed. The freelance work that once excited him had become erratic. Algorithms changed, clients disappeared, payments arrived late or not at all. He told Seo-yeon he was fine, that projects were lined up. In reality, his savings were nearly gone. Credit card balances crept higher each month. The quiet shame of it settled into his chest like a weight he could not dislodge. By dawn, that weight would become something else entirely. The following morning, Seo-yeon woke to sunlight filtering through sheer curtains and the distant sound of traffic beginning its daily rhythm. She checked her phone immediately. Still nothing. She sent a short message, casual on the surface. "Did you make it home? Call me when you can." Hours passed without reply. At noon, she called Min-yi's phone. It rang until voicemail. She called again in the afternoon, then again. With each unanswered call, her unease sharpened into something closer to fear. By evening, she left work early and took a taxi to the studio he sometimes used, a place she had visited only once before. The door to the building was unlocked. Inside, the hallway lights flickered faintly. She followed the numbers until she reached the studio. The door was ajar. What Seo-yeon found inside would fracture her life into a before and an after. Min-yi lay on the floor beside the desk, unmoving. The monitors still glowed, casting cold light across his face. There was blood dark against the concrete, and the smell of iron hung heavy in the air. Seo-yeon screamed, a sound that echoed down the hallway and brought other tenants running. Emergency services arrived within minutes, then police. Seo-yeon was ushered outside, wrapped in a blanket she did not remember receiving. A paramedic spoke to her, but the words seemed to drift past without meaning. She stared at the building, waiting for someone to tell her this was a mistake, that Min-yi would walk out, annoyed at the commotion. He did not. By midnight, the studio was sealed off with yellow tape. Detectives moved in and out, their expressions unreadable. Initial assessments suggested suicide. There was no sign of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle. A note was found on Min-yi's phone, unsent, addressed to no one in particular. It spoke of exhaustion, of failure, of being tired of disappointing everyone. The case, at first glance, seemed tragically simple, but simplicity has a way of unraveling. In the days that followed, inconsistencies emerged. The position of Min-yi's body did not entirely align with the preliminary timeline. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices late that night, though none could identify who they belonged to. A nearby security camera had been disabled during a narrow window of time. And Seo-yeon, once the initial shock subsided, began to question details she could not ignore. Min-yi had always been careful, meticulous even, about his equipment. Yet the studio was in disarray. His phone showed deleted messages, fragments of conversations he had never mentioned. And the note, so final in tone, felt oddly incomplete, as if written under pressure rather than resignation. As police quietly shifted the case from routine death investigation to something more complex, the media caught wind. Headlines began to appear, careful at first, then increasingly speculative. A respected creative professional found dead. Questions surrounding the circumstances. A grieving wife at the center of it all. By the end of that first week, what had begun as a private tragedy was already transforming into something public, contested, and far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. And this was only the beginning. The days following Min-yi's death blurred together for Seo-yeon in a haze of condolences, paperwork, and a relentless ache that seemed to settle into her bones. Friends filled her apartment with food she barely touched. Relatives spoke in hushed voices, careful not to say his name too loudly, as if doing so might break her completely. At night, when the apartment finally fell silent, she lay awake replaying fragments of memory, searching for a moment she had missed, a sentence she should have questioned more deeply. The police classified Min-yi's death as undetermined pending further investigation, a label that did little to quiet the storm building inside her. Officially, they said, there was no immediate evidence of foul play. Unofficially, detectives admitted there were gaps they couldn't yet explain. Detective Lee Jun-ho had been assigned to the case 3 days after Min-yi's body was found. In his early 40s, Lee had built a reputation for patience and an almost unsettling attention to detail. He did not rush conclusions. He believed cases spoke for themselves if you listened long enough. When he first reviewed the file, what struck him was not the note or the lack of forced entry, but the timing. Min Yi's estimated time of death placed the incident sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 1:00 a.m. The studio building's access logs showed Min Yi entering alone at 9:12 p.m. No exits were recorded until morning. On paper, it supported suicide. But Lee had learned not to trust paper too easily. He began with the neighbors. The building housed artists, editors, and small startups, people accustomed to keeping odd hours. Most reported nothing unusual. But one tenant, a sound engineer working on the floor below, mentioned hearing what sounded like an argument shortly after midnight. Two voices, one raised, one quieter but tense. The walls were thin enough for sound to travel, especially at night. Could you identify either voice? Lee asked. The man shook his head. No, I assumed it was just stress. Deadlines, you know. Another tenant mentioned something else. The elevator had stalled briefly that night. Around 12:20 a.m. she remembered because she had been late meeting a friend and cursed the delay. Maintenance records later confirmed a temporary outage, resolved within 15 minutes. Lee filed the detail away. When he reviewed the security footage from nearby buildings, he encountered the next problem. The camera covering the alley behind the studio complex had gone offline between 11:45 p.m. and 12:45 a.m. The timing aligned almost too perfectly with the estimated window of death. The building manager claimed it was a routine technical glitch. Lee requested the maintenance logs. They were incomplete. As the investigation deepened, Seo-yeon was called in for a formal interview. She sat across from Lee in a quiet room at the precinct, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She answered questions carefully, sometimes too carefully, choosing words as if each one might be used against her. Lee asked about her marriage. She spoke of routine disagreements, mostly about work and money, nothing violent, nothing that felt dangerous. She admitted Min Yi had been stressed, withdrawn. She denied any major fights in the days leading up to his death. Then Lee asked about the deleted messages on Min Yi's phone. Seo-yeon's breath caught. She hadn't known about those. They were already gone when we recovered the device, Lee said gently. Do you have any idea who he might have been speaking with? She shook her head. He didn't tell me everything. We had our own spaces. Yes. Lee watched her closely. Grief often manifested as confusion, defensiveness, or silence. Seo-yeon displayed all three. Still, something about her responses felt genuine if incomplete. After the interview, Lee requested Min Yi's financial records. What he found painted a picture far more precarious than Seo-yeon had described. Min Yi was deeply in debt. Several recent payments had bounced. A private lender, operating in a legal gray area, had been pressuring him for repayment. Text records recovered from the lender's phone showed escalating threats, thinly veiled but unmistakable. One message, sent 2 days before Min Yi's death, read, "You can't keep running. We will come to you." Lee felt the case shift under his feet. When Seo-yeon was informed about the debt, she broke down. She insisted she had no idea things were that bad. Min Yi had always handled finances related to his freelance work. She covered household expenses. It was a division they never formally discussed, one that now felt dangerously naive. Media coverage intensified as details leaked. Headlines shifted from tragedy to mystery. Online forums speculated wildly. Some painted Min Yi as a troubled artist overwhelmed by failure. Others questioned Seo-yeon's ignorance, her composure, her role. Anonymous posts dissected her interviews, her expressions, the way she spoke his name. The pressure was suffocating. Then, 2 weeks after Min Yi's death, Lee received a call that changed everything. A man had come forward, claiming to have seen Min-yi with someone else that night. The witness, a delivery driver, said he had been dropping off food near the studio around 11:50 p.m. He noticed Min-yi standing outside the building, speaking urgently with another man. The driver remembered the scene because Min-yi looked agitated, gesturing sharply, his voice raised enough to carry across the street. "Are you sure it was him?" Lee asked. The driver nodded. "I recognized him from the news later. Same jacket, same face." The other man, the driver said, wore a cap pulled low and left quickly, heading toward a parked car that sped off before the driver could catch the license plate. This account directly contradicted the access logs showing Min-yi entering alone and never leaving. Lee ordered a full review of the building's electronic records. What they discovered suggested manipulation. The access system had been tampered with, possibly using cloned credentials. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create the illusion of isolation. As police began quietly tracking the private lender and his associates, Seo-yeon found herself living under a different kind of scrutiny. Plainclothes officers appeared near her apartment. Journalists waited outside her workplace. Friends stopped calling, unsure of what to say or afraid of being pulled into the growing storm. At night, she replayed her last conversation with Min-yi. The short message. The tone she had dismissed as exhaustion. Now it sounded like fear. Fear of someone else. 3 weeks after Min-yi's death, Lee stood in the studio once more, staring at the space where Min-yi had died. He no longer believed he was looking at a suicide. He believed he was standing at the center of a carefully staged scene, one that relied on silence, assumptions, and a man's quiet shame to hide something far more violent. And if he was right, the truth was still out there, waiting to surface. By the time the investigation entered its 4th week, the case had quietly transformed from a questionable death into a full-scale homicide inquiry. The shift was not announced publicly. Detective Lee Junho knew better than to tip his hand too early. Whoever had gone to the trouble of manipulating access logs, deleting messages, and exploiting Min-yi's financial desperation was unlikely to sit still once they realized the narrative was changing. The first arrest came unexpectedly. The private lender, Kang D-sung, was brought in for questioning after financial crimes investigators uncovered a pattern of predatory lending tied to multiple freelancers and small business owners across Seoul. Kang presented himself as cooperative, almost amused by the attention. He wore an expensive watch, spoke calmly, and insisted he had nothing to do with Min-yi's death beyond normal business pressure. "You threaten people," Lee said during the interview, sliding printed text messages across the table. Kang barely glanced at them. "Threaten? No. I remind them of consequences. If someone borrows money and doesn't repay, there are consequences. That's how the world works." Lee watched him carefully. Kang never once asked how Min-yi had died. He never expressed shock. He only asked whether the debt would still be repaid. Under further questioning, Kang admitted he had sent associates to check on Min-yi several times over the past month. He claimed they were only meant to intimidate, not harm. According to Kang, one associate had gone alone on the night of Min-yi's death to deliver a final warning. That associate was identified as Park Sung-ho, a former nightclub bouncer with a history of assault charges that never quite stuck. Park disappeared the day Kang was questioned. Police obtained a warrant for Park's last known address, a small officetool on the outskirts of the city. Inside, they found little beyond a duffel bag containing clothes, a burner phone, and a notebook filled with numbers. Among them was Min-yi's studio address. The burner phone, however, proved far more revealing. Forensic analysts recovered deleted call logs and partial messages exchanged between Park and an unknown number labeled only as client. The timestamps placed Park in Min-yi's neighborhood just after midnight. Another message, sent at 12:34 a.m. read, "It's done. Didn't mean to go that far." Lee felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had seen this before. Violence that spiraled beyond intent, followed by panic, cover-ups, and silence bought with fear. As police expanded their search for Park, Seo-yeon was informed of the homicide determination. She sat in the same interview room where she had first spoken to Lee, but this time her posture was different. Less guarded, more hollow. "He didn't kill himself," she said, not as a question, but a statement. "No," Lee replied. "We don't believe he did." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong." When Lee told her about the debt, the threats, and the possibility that Min-yi had been confronted that night, Seo-yeon's grief shifted into something sharper. Anger, guilt, a quiet fury directed as much at herself as at the people who had cornered her husband into silence. "He thought he had to handle it alone," she said softly. "He always did." Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the reclassification. Headlines erupted overnight. The story was no longer about a tragic death, but a system that allowed unregulated lending, intimidation, and exploitation to flourish in the shadows of a modern city. Online speculation intensified. Some questioned why Min-yi hadn't gone to the police. Others blamed societal pressures, the stigma of failure, the weight placed on men to endure silently. A few still fixated on Seo-yeon, dissecting her reactions with cruel precision. Behind the scenes, Lee's team tracked Park's movements through transit cards, traffic cameras, and cell tower pings. The trail led south, then east, then vanished near a coastal town. Days later, a fisherman reported a suspicious vehicle abandoned near a breakwater. Inside, police found bloodstains, a damaged phone, and a wallet belonging to Park Sung-ho. The body was never recovered. Investigators suspected Kang had ordered Park silenced once the situation escalated. When confronted with the evidence, Kang's composure finally cracked. He denied involvement in Park's disappearance, but his alibi collapsed under scrutiny. Surveillance footage placed him near the coastal town on the same night the car was abandoned. Kang was arrested on charges including extortion, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit assault resulting in death. The homicide charge, however, remained more complex. Without Park's body or a direct confession, prosecutors faced an uphill battle. They relied on circumstantial evidence, digital records, and the testimony of the delivery driver who had witnessed Min-yi arguing outside the studio. The reconstructed timeline told a chilling story. Park confronted Min-yi outside the building. The argument escalated. Park followed Min-yi inside, using cloned access credentials supplied by someone with technical knowledge. In the studio, the confrontation turned physical. Min-yi was struck, possibly pushed. The injury proved fatal. Panicking, Park staged the scene to resemble suicide, deleting messages and manipulating logs before fleeing. Kang, realizing the gravity of what had happened, helped cover it up, believing money and influence could bury the truth as it always had before. They were wrong. As the case moved toward trial, Seo-yeon attended every hearing. She listened as prosecutors dissected Min-yi's final hours, reducing her husband's life to evidence, timelines, and exhibits. Each detail reopened wounds she wasn't sure would ever fully heal, but there was also a strange sense of purpose taking shape. She began speaking publicly about financial exploitation, about the silent desperation faced by freelancers and creatives trapped between pride and fear. Her words resonated. Advocacy groups invited her to share Min-yi's story, not as a spectacle but as a warning. The trial began 6 months after Min-yi's death. Kang Di-sung sat stone-faced as witnesses testified. The delivery driver, the forensic analysts. the building manager who admitted under oath that he had accepted cash to overlook irregularities in the security system. Each testimony tightened the net. When closing arguments concluded, the courtroom was silent. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty. Kang was convicted of conspiracy, coercion, and manslaughter. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, stripped of the power and privilege he had wielded so casually for years. Justice, however, felt incomplete. Park Sung-ho remained missing, presumed dead. The full truth of Min Yi's final moments would never be known. There were no last words, no opportunity for explanation or forgiveness. As the courtroom emptied after sentencing, Seo-yeon remained seated for a long time. Detective Lee stood nearby, giving her space. "It doesn't bring him back," she finally said. "No," Lee replied, "but it tells the truth." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and relentless. New headlines replaced old ones. New tragedies waited in the wings. But Min Yi's story lingered. It lingered in policy discussions about predatory lending, in training seminars for law enforcement, in quiet conversations between couples who learned, too late or just in time, the cost of silence. And as the final chapter approached, the question remained whether anything meaningful could truly rise from so much loss. In the weeks following the verdict, the city returned to its familiar rhythm. But for Seo-yeon, time no longer moved in predictable ways. Some days passed in a blur so dense she could barely remember getting out of bed. Other moments stretched endlessly, filled with memories that surfaced without warning, fragments of Min Yi's laughter, his quiet concentration when he worked, the way he used to pause before answering difficult questions. The trial had ended, but grief did not recognize legal closure. Detective Lee Jun-ho checked in once, then twice, and then less frequently, as he had learned to do with survivors. He knew there was a point where presence helped and another where it reopened wounds. Still, the case lingered in his thoughts. He had closed files before, but this one resisted that final sense of resolution. Too many gaps remained. Too much damage had occurred long before the fatal night. The studio where Min Yi died was eventually cleared and rented to someone else. The walls were repainted, the windows replaced. From the outside, nothing suggested what had happened there. Seo-yeon passed the building only once after the trial. She stood across the street, watching strangers enter and exit, their lives untouched by the invisible history layered into that space. Then she turned away, knowing she did not need to see it again. Public interest in the case slowly shifted from shock to reflection. Journalists published long-form investigations into illegal private lending networks operating across Asia's major cities. Lawmakers cited Min Yi's death during hearings on financial regulation reform. Some changes were symbolic. Others, more substantial, came too late for him but not for those who would follow. Seo-yeon declined most interview requests. When she did speak, she avoided sensational details. She talked instead about isolation, about how shame can become a weapon when exploited by the wrong people. Her voice was steady but never rehearsed. People listened because she was not trying to convince them of anything. She was simply telling the truth as she had lived it. Privately, the questions never stopped. What if she had asked more? What if she had noticed the debt, the pressure, the quiet fear in Min Yi's eyes? These thoughts surfaced late at night, uninvited and relentless. Therapy helped, but it did not erase the underlying ache. Healing, she learned, was not a straight path. It was a series of fragile steps forward, interrupted by sudden falls backward. On the anniversary of Min Yi's death, Seo-yeon visited the sea near the town where Park Sung-ho's car had been found. The water was calm, deceptively peaceful. There was no marker, no sign acknowledging what had happened there. She stood at the edge for a long time, not looking for answers, but allowing herself to accept that some would never come. Park's body was never recovered. Officially, his fate remained unresolved. Unofficially, everyone involved understood what had likely happened. Kang's network had collapsed under investigation, revealing a chain of exploitation that extended far beyond Min Yi. Other victims came forward. Some cases resulted in convictions. Others ended quietly, lost to time and insufficient evidence. Justice, Seo-yeon realized, was not a single moment. It was uneven, incomplete, and often deeply unsatisfying, but it mattered nonetheless. Detective Lee eventually transferred to a different unit. On his last day in Major Crimes, he reviewed the file one final time before sealing it. He added a note, not for the court, but for himself. A reminder that crimes like this rarely begin with violence. They begin with pressure, with fear, with systems that allow suffering to remain invisible until it becomes fatal. Years from now, he knew, the case would be cited in training manuals, reduced to bullet points and lessons learned. The human cost would be summarized in a paragraph or two, but he would remember the silences, the delays, the way the truth had almost been buried beneath convenience and assumption. Seo-yeon moved forward slowly. She changed careers, stepping away from the life she had shared with Min Yi and into one shaped by her own hard-earned perspective. She made new friends who knew her not as a widow or a symbol, but simply as herself. She allowed happiness to return in quiet, unexpected ways, though it always carried a shadow. Min Yi's name continued to surface in conversations about reform, about accountability, about the unseen dangers that thrive in modern cities. His story became a cautionary one, not because of how he died, but because of how easily his suffering had gone unnoticed. In the end, there was no grand conclusion, no sense of balance restored. There was only the truth, brought reluctantly into the light, and the lives left to carry it forward. And in that truth, imperfect and incomplete as it was, there remained a single, undeniable certainty. Min Yi's death was not meaningless. It exposed a darkness many preferred not to see, and in doing so, it forced a reckoning that might just possibly prevent the next tragedy from unfolding in the same silence. Story 5. On a cold February morning in 2025, the city of Leeds woke beneath a low gray sky, the kind that pressed down on rooftops and made even familiar streets feel uncertain. Commuters moved as they always did, collars turned up, coffee cups warming their hands, unaware that by nightfall the city would be gripped by a story that would dominate headlines across the United Kingdom. It would begin, as so many devastating cases do, with something ordinary. A missed train, an unanswered phone call, a silence that stretched just long enough to make someone uneasy. 32-year-old Elena Wright was not the type of person people worried about. She was reliable in a way that bordered on predictable. She texted when she arrived. She called when she was running late. She showed up early to meetings and stayed late to help colleagues who were falling behind. So when she failed to arrive at the architectural firm where she worked, her absence was noticed immediately. By 9:30 a.m., her manager had already tried calling her twice. By 10:00, a colleague sent a message asking if she was feeling unwell. There was no response. Elena lived alone in a renovated Victorian terrace in Headingley, a neighborhood popular with young professionals and postgraduate students. She had bought the house 3 years earlier, proud of the independence it represented. It was her first real investment in a future she had worked hard to build. Raised in York by parents who valued discipline and education, Elena had followed a steady, determined path. Grammar school, University of Sheffield, a postgraduate degree, a respected position at a firm known for sustainable urban design. From the outside, her life looked stable, even enviable. But stability often hides quiet pressure. In the months leading up to February 2025, Elena's workload had increased dramatically. The firm had secured several major contracts, and deadlines were relentless. Friends noticed she was canceling plans more frequently, citing exhaustion. Her younger sister, Hannah, remembered teasing her during a January phone call, telling her she needed to slow down before she burned out. Eleanor had laughed it off, promising she would take a proper holiday in the spring. That holiday would never come. By midday, concern had escalated. Eleanor's phone was still going straight to voicemail. Her laptop had not logged into the firm's network. A colleague who lived nearby volunteered to check on her house. When he arrived, he noticed something that immediately unsettled him. Eleanor's car was parked outside, exactly where it should have been if she had been home overnight. The curtains were drawn, unusual for someone who typically opened them early. He knocked. There was no answer. At 12:47 p.m., West Yorkshire Police received a call requesting a welfare check. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. They found no signs of forced entry at the front door. The back garden gate, however, was slightly ajar. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but it caught the attention of one of the responding officers. Eleanor was meticulous about security. Neighbors had commented before on how careful she was, always locking up, always double-checking. The officers entered the house. What they found inside would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing investigations the city had seen in years. Eleanor was discovered in the upstairs bedroom. The room showed no immediate signs of a struggle, but the stillness was wrong. The air felt heavy, unnatural. She was lying on the bed, partially covered by a duvet, as if someone had tried unsuccessfully to make her appear at rest. A single lamp was on, casting a dull yellow light across the room. It was the middle of the day, yet the curtains remained closed. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing they could do. Eleanor Wright was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assessment raised more questions than answers. There were no obvious defensive wounds, no visible weapon, no note. The house had not been ransacked. Valuables were untouched. Her handbag sat neatly by the front door. Her phone, however, was missing. By early afternoon, the street was cordoned off. Police vehicles lined the road. Curious neighbors gathered behind tape, whispering, speculating, trying to reconcile the image of the woman they waved to each morning with the reality unfolding behind the brick walls of her home. News spread quickly, first through local social media groups, then through online news outlets hungry for details. Detective Inspector Marcus Hale was assigned as the senior investigating officer. Hale had spent over 20 years in major crimes, and he had learned to trust the quiet details. He walked through the house slowly, absorbing its atmosphere. Everything about the space spoke of order: clean lines, carefully chosen furniture, plants watered on schedule. This was not a place where chaos belonged. The bedroom told a more complicated story. There were subtle signs of disturbance. The duvet was slightly twisted, not as neatly arranged as Eleanor would have left it. A bedside glass contained water, but forensic testing would later show Eleanor had not drunk from it. The window was closed, locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere upstairs. As forensic teams began their work, Hale focused on timelines. When had Eleanor last been seen? Who had spoken to her last? What had her final hours looked like? Her phone records showed her last outgoing call had been made at 8:12 p.m. the previous evening. The call lasted less than a minute. The number belonged to a man named Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed was not a stranger. He was Eleanor's former partner. They had met 4 years earlier at a professional networking event in Manchester. Thomas worked in property development, charismatic and ambitious, with a talent for making people feel seen. Their relationship had moved quickly. Within a year, they were living together. Friends initially described them as well-matched, driven, supportive. But over time, subtle changes emerged. Eleanor became quieter around him, less confident. She began second-guessing herself in ways that were new and unsettling. Hannah noticed it first. Thomas had opinions about everything, from what Alina wore to how she spent her weekends. He framed his control as concern, his criticism as guidance. They separated in late 2024 after a particularly volatile argument that neighbors later recalled hearing through the shared wall. Alina had confided in a close friend that she felt relieved when he moved out, but also shaken. Thomas had not taken the breakup well. He sent long messages oscillating between apology and blame. Eventually, Alina stopped responding, or so she thought. Detectives learned that Thomas Reed had been seen in Headingley the night before Alina's body was discovered. CCTV footage from a nearby convenience store captured him purchasing cigarettes at 7:48 p.m. He lived nearly 30 miles away. When police attempted to contact him, they discovered his phone was switched off. By evening, the investigation had escalated into a full homicide inquiry. The post-mortem examination would later reveal that Alina had been killed by asphyxiation. There were signs consistent with manual strangulation, but minimal external bruising, suggesting controlled, sustained pressure. It was an intimate act, one that required proximity, time, and intent. This was not a random crime. As news broke that Alina's death was being treated as murder, public reaction was swift and visceral. Headlines described her as a rising professional, a talented architect, a woman with everything ahead of her. Social media filled with tributes, photos of Alina smiling at project launches, laughing at birthdays, standing proudly in front of buildings she had helped design. But beneath the grief, another conversation began to emerge, one that felt uncomfortably familiar. Why hadn't anyone known how unsafe she might have been? Friends replayed conversations in their minds, searching for missed warnings. Colleagues wondered whether stress had masked something darker. Her sister combed through old messages, noticing phrases that now felt heavy with unspoken meaning. "I'm just tired. I'll explain later. It's complicated." By the end of the first day, police confirmed they were actively searching for Thomas Reed in connection with the murder. His car, a gray Audi, was flagged nationwide. Border agencies were alerted. Ports and airports were notified. Somewhere, Hale knew the truth was already set in motion. It was only a matter of time before it surfaced, dragging with it the details that would force the country to confront yet another story of control, obsession, and violence hiding behind the appearance of normal life. And this time, the reckoning would not come quietly. By the second morning of the investigation, Leeds no longer felt like the same city. The rain that began before dawn clung to pavements and windows, blurring streetlights into halos of pale yellow. News vans parked along Headingley streets, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky like watchful eyes. Alina Wright's name was now known far beyond the neighborhood where she had lived quietly, methodically, believing she was safe. Detective Inspector Marcus Hale arrived at headquarters before sunrise. He had slept little, his mind looping through timelines, relationships, inconsistencies. Experience had taught him that the first 48 hours were critical, not just for gathering evidence but for understanding the emotional geometry of a crime. Who felt entitled to Alina's time? Who believed they still belonged in her life? Who could enter her home without raising alarm? The answer, increasingly, pointed in one direction. Thomas Reed's flat in Harrogate was searched under warrant at 6:20 a.m. Officers found it half-packed, clothing missing from wardrobes, drawers left open. His laptop was gone. So was his passport. The fridge contained expired food, untouched for days. On the kitchen table lay a crumpled envelope addressed to Alina, never sent. Inside were several handwritten pages, dense with looping script that veered between apology and accusation. He wrote of betrayal, of humiliation, of sacrifices he believed he had made. He wrote that she had abandoned him when he needed her most. Hale read the letter slowly, feeling the familiar weight settle in his chest. He had seen this language before. It wasn't love. It was ownership disguised as devotion. CCTV analysis began in earnest. Cameras from Headingley, Harrogate, and routes between the two cities were pulled. Analysts traced Thomas's Audi leaving Harrogate at 6:42 p.m. on February 9th, traveling south. It appeared again near a leaner street just after 7:30. The convenience store footage had already placed him nearby at 7:48. Another camera, partially obscured by scaffolding, captured a figure matching his build entering a leaner street at 8:03 p.m. What happened after that was a void. No camera directly covered a leaner's front door. There were no neighbors who reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The terrace walls were thick, the street quiet. If Thomas had entered willingly, there would have been no sound to raise concern. Investigators turned to Alina's digital footprint. Her laptop revealed a series of unsent draft emails addressed to HR, expressing concern about stress and asking about flexible hours. Another draft, never completed, was addressed to a domestic abuse support organization. It contained only a subject line. Not sure if this counts. That single sentence reverberated through the room. Hannah Wright was brought in to give a formal statement that afternoon. She sat rigidly in the interview room, hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her memory was sharp. She described Thomas's charm, his gradual isolation of Alina, the way he framed jealousy as care. She recalled a Christmas argument where Thomas had accused Alina of prioritizing work over their relationship, his voice rising, his face red with anger. Alina had brushed it off afterward, insisting it wasn't serious. She didn't want to be dramatic, Hannah said quietly. She always thought if she just explained herself better, he'd understand. Police learned that Alina had blocked Thomas's number in January. The call at 8:12 p.m. the night before her death had come from a withheld number. The duration, 47 seconds, suggested little more than an exchange of words. There was no recording, no voicemail, only silence after. As pressure mounted, Thomas Reed remained missing. At 11:40 p.m. on February 11th, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A toll booth camera near Dover captured the Audi entering the port area earlier that evening. Border Force confirmed that a man matching Thomas's description had attempted to book passage on a late ferry to Calais using a different surname. The booking had been flagged due to discrepancies in identification. By the time officers arrived, the ferry had already departed. The news hit the investigation team like a punch to the gut. International coordination began immediately. French authorities were notified. European arrest warrants were prepared. Hell knew that flight was as telling as any confession. Innocent men do not run like this. They stay. They demand answers. They insist on their right to be heard. Thomas Reed was trying to disappear. Public reaction intensified. Media coverage exploded, dissecting every available detail. Commentators debated the warning signs of coercive control. Advocacy groups spoke out about the dangers of underestimating emotional abuse. Alina's story became a prism through which countless others saw reflections of their own experiences. Then, 3 days after the ferry crossing, a call came from Lyon. French police had detained a British national following a disturbance at a small hotel near the city center. The man had been drinking heavily, shouting in English, accusing staff of conspiring against him. His identification confirmed it was Thomas Reed. When West Yorkshire detectives arrived to escort him back to the UK, Thomas appeared hollowed out. His confidence, once effortless, had collapsed into agitation. He avoided eye contact, his hands shaking slightly as cuffs were secured around his wrists. During the flight back, he said nothing. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. The interview began within hours of his return. Thomas initially denied everything. He claimed he had gone to Alina's house only to talk, to seek closure. He said she had invited him, that she was upset that they had argued, but he left when things became heated. He insisted she was alive when he walked out. Hale listened without interruption. Then he placed the evidence on the table. The CCTV timeline, the letter, the post-mortem findings. The fact that Alina's phone, missing from the house, had pinged briefly near the ferry terminal before going dead forever. The forensic report showing traces of Thomas's DNA beneath Alina's fingernails, too minimal for a violent struggle but present nonetheless. Something shifted. Thomas's voice faltered, his narrative frayed. He spoke of feeling replaced, irrelevant. He said Alina had looked at him like a stranger. He said she had told him she was done, that she was afraid of him. That word, afraid, seemed to trigger something inside him. He stopped speaking. Minutes passed in silence. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "I just wanted her to listen." The confession, when it came, was halting and fragmented. Thomas described confronting Alina in her kitchen, accusing her of humiliating him, of blocking him out of her life. He said she had tried to calm him, to set boundaries. He said she had asked him to leave. When she turned toward the stairs, he followed. What happened in the bedroom, he claimed, got out of hand. He said he grabbed her, that she struggled briefly, that he panicked. He insisted he never meant to kill her. The forensic pathologist would later dismantle that claim with clinical precision. Asphyxiation requires sustained pressure. Minutes, not seconds. Awareness. Choice. When Alina stopped moving, Thomas said he sat beside her, waiting for her to breathe again. She never did. In court months later, the details would be laid bare. But in that interview room, as Thomas's confession was recorded, Hale felt no triumph. Only the familiar, heavy knowledge that another life had been erased, not by sudden madness, but by entitlement left unchecked. As Thomas was charged with murder and remanded in custody, Alina's family gathered in York, surrounded by flowers, letters, and candles that continued to arrive from strangers. Hannah stood by her parents, holding their hands, trying to imagine a future reshaped by absence. The investigation was nearing its end, but the story was far from over. Because what Alina's death had exposed went beyond one man, one relationship, one city. It had forced a reckoning with how often control masquerades as care, how easily warning signs are dismissed, and how deadly that dismissal can become. And soon, the court would decide not only Thomas Reed's fate, but how the justice system would frame the meaning of Alina Wright's final moments. The courtroom at Leeds Crown Court was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the air had learned to hold its breath. It was late September 2025 when Thomas Reed was brought in for the first day of his trial, and by then, Alina Wright's name had become etched into the national consciousness. Her photograph, the one most often used by the press, showed her standing in front of a newly completed building, hard hat tucked under her arm, smiling with quiet pride. It was an image of competence, of purpose. Seeing it projected on the screen above the witness stand felt almost cruel. Thomas sat between two officers, his shoulders hunched, his face thinner than it had been in photographs taken just months earlier. Gone was the polished confidence that had once drawn people to him. In its place was something smaller, tighter, like a man trying to fold himself inward. When Alina's family entered the courtroom, he did not look up. The prosecution opened with a statement that was calm, methodical, and devastating. This, they said, was not a crime of passion. It was the culmination of months of coercive control, emotional manipulation, and an escalating refusal to accept rejection. The jury was told they would hear how Thomas Reed believed he was entitled to Alina's time, her attention, her emotional labor, even after she had ended the relationship. They would hear how, when that entitlement was challenged, it turned lethal. The defense argued a different narrative. They acknowledged the death but framed it as a tragic accident born of emotional instability and mutual conflict. They spoke of Thomas's mental health struggles, of his inability to cope with abandonment, of a moment where control was lost rather than seized. They urged the jury to see him not as a monster, but as a flawed man who made an irreversible mistake. Over the following weeks, the court examined every layer of Alina's life. Colleagues testified about her professionalism, her reliability, the subtle changes they had noticed in her behavior during the final year of her relationship. One described how Alina had started staying late at the office, not because she had to, but because it felt easier than going home. Another recalled how Alina once flinched when her phone buzzed unexpectedly during a meeting, then laughed it off with an apology. Friends spoke of canceled plans, of Thomas's presence at gatherings where Alina seemed smaller somehow, quieter. A close friend recounted a night when Alina had confided that she felt like she was walking on eggshells, afraid that any disagreement would spiral into accusation. She had said it wasn't abuse, not really. He just feels things very deeply, she'd explained. The jury listened as experts described coercive control, how it rarely begins with violence, how it thrives in ambiguity. They learned how patterns of monitoring, criticism, and emotional dependency can erode a person's sense of autonomy long before bruises ever appear. The prosecution presented Alina's unsent email draft to the support organization, its unfinished subject line echoing through the courtroom like a question left unanswered. Then came the forensic evidence. The pathologist testified with clinical detachment about Alina's injuries, the lack of extensive bruising, the consistency of sustained pressure, the certainty that this was not a momentary lapse but a prolonged act. The room felt colder as the implications settled in. This had taken time. This had required decision after decision, each one a chance to stop. CCTV footage was shown tracing Thomas's movements that night, the convenience store, the walk down Alina's street, the absence of any footage showing him leaving before the estimated time of death, his attempted escape through Dover, his flight to France, his behavior after arrest. When Thomas took the stand, the atmosphere shifted again. He spoke softly, often pausing as if searching for the right words. He described his relationship with Alina as intense, emotionally charged. He said he loved her deeply, that he felt blindsided by the breakup. He claimed he had gone to her house to talk, not to harm. He admitted to grabbing her, to restraining her, but insisted he hadn't realized the danger until it was too late. The prosecutor's cross-examination was precise. He asked Thomas why, if it had been an accident, he had not called for help, why he had staged the scene, why he had taken Alina's phone, why he had fled the country. Each question narrowed the space in which Thomas could hide. His answers grew defensive, then vague. At one point he snapped, his voice rising as he accused Alina of provoking him, of pushing him away like he was nothing. The outburst hung in the air. In that moment the mask slipped. The entitlement surfaced again, raw and unfiltered. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Jurors exchanged glances. The narrative Thomas had tried to construct cracked under the weight of his own words. Outside the courtroom, public discourse intensified. Advocacy groups gathered daily, holding signs bearing Alina's name, calling for stronger recognition of coercive control as a precursor to lethal violence. Commentators dissected the case across radio and television, drawing connections to other women killed after leaving controlling partners. The phrase, "Why didn't she leave sooner?" was challenged, reframed, rejected. She had left, and that the country was being forced to confront was often the most dangerous moment of all. Hannah Wright attended every day of the trial. She listened to strangers describe her sister in fragments, through documents and timelines, through the lens of evidence rather than memory. Some nights she went home and scrolled through old messages, searching for the version of Alina that existed before fear crept in. Other nights she couldn't sleep at all, her mind replaying testimony she wished she had never heard. When the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom felt exhausted, as if it had absorbed too much grief to function normally. Closing arguments would come next, followed by deliberation. A verdict loomed. But even as the legal process moved toward resolution, something else was unfolding beyond the courtroom walls. Alina's story was changing how people spoke about control, about warning signs, about responsibility. Employers reviewed safeguarding policies. Universities held talks on healthy relationships. Helplines reported a surge in calls from individuals recognizing pieces of their own lives in Alina's. Her death was no longer just a case. It had become a mirror. And soon, the jury would decide whether Thomas Reed would be held fully accountable for what he had done, or whether the system would soften its response to a crime rooted not in sudden rage, but in sustained, deliberate domination. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Those days stretched painfully long for everyone waiting, but especially for Alina's family. Hannah sat in the same wooden chair each morning, hands folded so tightly her knuckles stayed white. She tried not to imagine what was being said in the jury room, how strangers were dissecting her sister's final moments, weighing intent and responsibility as though life could be reduced to legal language. She reminded herself that this was how justice worked. That process mattered, even when it hurt. On the 4th morning, the call came. The courtroom filled quickly, the quiet buzz of movement carrying an undercurrent of tension that pressed against the chest. Thomas Reed was led back into the dock. He looked paler than before, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. He did not turn when Alina's parents entered, nor when Hannah took her seat beside them. The foreman of the jury stood. On the charge of murder, the verdict was guilty. For a moment the words seemed unreal, as if they belonged to another room, another life. Then Alina's mother let out a sound that was half breath, half sob, and the reality landed with full force. Hannah felt her own tears spill over, not dramatic, not loud, just steady and unstoppable. Around them, people shifted, some exhaling in relief, others wiping their eyes. Thomas reacted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders dropped a fraction, as though a tension he had been holding onto finally released. He blinked several times, then shook his head slowly, still refusing to look toward Alina's family. When the judge asked him to stand, he did so stiffly, gripping the edge of the dock. The judge's sentencing remarks were measured and firm. This was, he said, a deliberate killing rooted in control and entitlement. Alina Wright had been a capable, independent woman whose life was systematically constrained by a man who could not accept her autonomy. The court rejected any suggestion that this was an accident or a momentary loss of control. The evidence showed sustained pressure, conscious decisions, and actions taken after the fact to evade responsibility. Thomas Reed was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 32 years before parole could be considered. As he was led away, the courtroom remained silent. No one applauded. There was no sense of victory, only an ending, heavy and incomplete. Outside, cameras flashed as Alina's family emerged. Hannah stepped forward to read a prepared statement, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke of Alina's kindness, her ambition, her stubborn sense of right and wrong. She spoke of the warning signs they had not recognized soon enough, of the guilt that still lingered. She spoke directly to those watching, urging anyone who felt controlled or afraid to seek help, to trust that discomfort was reason enough to act. "This verdict doesn't bring my sister back," she said. But if her story helps even one person see danger sooner, then her life continues to matter. In the weeks that followed, the public attention slowly faded, as it always did. New stories replaced old ones. Headlines moved on, but the impact of the case did not disappear entirely. The government announced a review of how coercive control cases were handled in early intervention stages. Police forces across the UK updated training modules, emphasizing non-physical abuse as a critical risk factor. Employers circulated guidance on supporting staff experiencing domestic control. Aliner's name appeared in reports, in seminars, in quiet conversations between friends who suddenly found the courage to ask difficult questions. For Hannah, grief took on new shapes. Some days were functional. She returned to work, answered emails, laughed at the right moments. Other days were impossible. She found herself standing in supermarkets unable to choose between brands Aliner used to buy, or stopping mid-sentence because a phrase sounded too much like her sister's voice. Time did not heal so much as it reshaped the pain, sanding down its sharpest edges while leaving the weight intact. She visited Aliner's flat once it was cleared. The space felt smaller without her presence, stripped of the life that had once filled it. Hannah stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, then turned away. Some places, she realized, didn't need revisiting to be remembered. Thomas Reed began his life behind bars, another inmate number, another case discussed in criminology lectures and legal journals. He filed an appeal, citing mental health considerations and procedural arguments. It was denied. Over time, his name would become less familiar, his story condensed into footnotes and statistics. Aliner's name, however, lingered differently. A scholarship was established in her honor for women entering engineering, funded by donations that arrived from strangers who had never met her but felt compelled to contribute. A small plaque was placed near the river where she used to walk, not marking her death but celebrating her life. It read simply, "She chose her own path." On the anniversary of the verdict, Hannah returned to that spot alone. She watched the water move steadily past, indifferent yet constant. She thought about how Aliner had once said that rivers reminded her that nothing stayed still forever, not even pain. Hannah breathed in, then out. The story, she knew, would always be told in fragments, in court transcripts, in news articles, in whispered warnings between friends. But beyond the crime, beyond the violence, there was a woman who had loved her work, her family, her freedom. That was the story Hannah chose to carry forward, not as a tragedy alone, but as a reminder. Control can wear the mask of love. Silence can feel safer than confrontation. Leaving can be the most dangerous step, and awareness, though imperfect, can save lives. Aliner Wright's life ended violently, unjustly. But the echo of her story continued, quietly shaping how people listened, how they questioned, how they intervened. In that echo, something meaningful survived. And that, Hannah decided, mattered. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.